Okay. Well, Chag Sameach, everyone. Welcome to ILOVEVBS Shalom. My name is Rabbi Noah Farkas, and it is Erev Shavuot. Shavuot has always been a holiday where we celebrate the giving of the Torah, the coming together of a community, and the celebration of the end of the barley harvest. And if you bring all those things together, and really what it is the ingathering of the community coming together. And the tradition around Shavuot is to do learning, is to learn Torah in whatever that means, all night long, to prepare ourselves for the giving of the Torah, which will happen tomorrow morning when we read the Ten Commandments. And I want to do a special welcome to those of us who are in the Zoom room. If you're online on Facebook or on YouTube and would like to join the Zoom room, you are welcome to do that. All you have to do is go to our website, vbs.org, and go to the ILOVEVBS Shalom at homepage, where you can find the link to the Zoom room. And for those who are not joining us by Zoom, really wonderful to have you here. And we're going to be learning together. And so if you are on Facebook or on YouTube, I'll try to, especially Facebook, try to find those comments and try to react to them too. So we're just really glad that you're here, and we're ready to get started. For those of us who are watching and those of us who are together with us all together, let us begin by saying a blessing over our learning. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, God, who enriches our lives with the commandments as we prepare ourselves and busy ourselves to study the Torah. So this evening, we have 3 sessions for you for VBS. We were already on the Rabbinical Assembly learning earlier, an hour ago or so. And we are now ready to learn. Our 3 sessions are all about what it means to build a home in the world. And that's a home for us and a home for God and a home for a community. So the 3 sessions will begin with my session, which is the sort of warm-up preparatory session about what the concept of home means, called homes crafted and created in rabbinic literature. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. And then that will lead to our evening service, where Cantor Barron will be leading our services, and with I can see Kenner Fox is also on, so it's really great to have him here too. And then Rabbi Feinstein will be picking up on my themes that I started, and then talking about Zionism itself as homecoming, sort of looking at some of the modern thinkers on how home plays out in the Zionist thinkers. And then the 2 of us will join in dialogue as we teach about how not to lose our home. And we're going to study some of the texts that talk a lot about what home means in terms of preventing our home from being lost. And the reason why we chose this topic is not just theological. It's not just about looking at God and thinking about Matan Torah, but we're looking at the world we live in, and that we live in a world where our home, the state of Israel, again seems threatened over and over again. And so tonight, the themes of home, as they go from more abstract to more concrete over the course of the evening, is really meant to cast through the lens of how it is to be a Jew and what it means to be at home in the world as a Jew, and how Israel in many ways gives us that power of home and homeland that we haven't really experienced until the modern age. So in many ways, this learning and this teaching is taught in the name of those who are protecting and living in our homeland, in the land of Israel. We're going to begin now. So if you please welcome, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about this concept of home and what it means to have a home both crafted and created. So home itself, in American literature, home and house are technically synonyms, but we know that they're not. Right? Having a house is having 4 structures with the walls and a roof, and that's a particular type of dwelling. But having a home is this other emotional sense. It's almost like house is the physical part and home is the emotional or spiritual part. And that bifurcation in thinking is also clear in rabbinic literature. And so we're going to look at 3 sections. And what we're going to do is I'm going to teach each section, a few minutes on each, and then we'll open it up for discussion, and then we'll go to the next section and do the same, and then to the final section and do the same. And the idea is to really think about what does it mean to have a home, and what does it mean for a Jew specifically to have a home. And again, we're going to study this in rabbinic literature and a couple of Bible verses from Tanakh, but rabbinic literature. And you always have to remember, rabbinic literature, it was written a very long time ago, but it always was written in diaspora. It was written outside of the political homeland of the state of Israel, or the land of Israel, or the kingdom of Israel. So the idea of a Jew feeling at home is part of the emotional context that we'll see play out throughout all these texts. So the first thing we're going to talk about when thinking about home is from the Talmud, from the Mishnah, and from the Talmud from Masechet Sukkot. And Sukkot is the section of the Talmud that deals with the holiday of Sukkah. So it's one of the sister holidays to the one we're celebrating tonight, Shavuot. And there is no better question about home than in Masechet Sukkah, because you're supposed to build a home, a temporary home called a sukkah, a booth, and you're supposed to dwell in it for 7 days. So in this piece of rabbinic literature, they ask Hillel about what it means to have a home, and he kind of waxes philosophic. So if everyone can take a look at this with me, and if you are on the Zoom, can someone just give me a thumbs up that they can see it so that I can, thank you, begin to teach. So they say, this is from the Tosefta, which is from a Tannaitic piece of literature right around the year 150 or so after the Common Era. So it's quite old. And it says, Tanya Amru Alav al Hillel Hazaken, Kishahaya Sameach Bisimchat Beit HaShweva, Amar Ken Imanikan, Hakolkan Ve'im Enikan Mikan. So they taught in this wonderful piece of literature, they asked of Hillel the elder during this celebration of Sukkot, where they drew out water. It was a water festival. And they asked them, if I am here, what is all this amazing rejoicing, right? This idea of the simchat, the wonderful joy of Beit HaShoeva, of the house of the drawing of water. Why is it called simchat Beit HaShoeva? There's joy that's supposed to happen with the drawing of water. And he said, if I am here, everyone is here. And if I am not here, who is here? Now, if you know Hillel, you know that he's prone to these kind of very pithy maxims. So he says in Hebrew, im kan hakol kan, v'im eni kan mi kan. And if you understand the poetry of the language, it sounds very similar to something he said in the Mishnah, in Pirkei Avot, where he says, if I am for myself, who will be for me? And if I am not for myself, or if I am only for myself, who am I? If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And if not now, when? It's the same construct as what he says here. If I am here, everyone is here. And if I am not here, then who will be here? And it's a rhetorical question, but it's one that really speaks to the power of home. So the first thing we learn from Hillel the Elder is that when you feel at home, the joy of this holiday, of building this sukkah, of being home, you say, if I am present, then I feel that everyone is present. But if I'm not present, then who can be present? The idea is that we have an obligation, a sacred obligation, that to create a space where you feel very present. And I know some of us, we all have different kinds of houses and we all have different kinds of homes and different kinds of family lives. But one of the things that being home feels like, to me anyway, is this idea that you can be totally present and be present with your family members and your friends. You don't have other distractions. You don't have work to do. It's something you can just sit on the couch and be with other people. Im anikan hakolkan. If I am here, everyone is here. Im enikan mikan. And if I'm not present, which you know this, if you're in a house and one of your kids or your friends or your family members isn't quite present and you're kind of like off on their own, it feels like no one's present. So the responsibility of being a home is about creating presence. Okay. The second thing that he says, though, he would say, which I also particularly love, he says, Hu haya omer, he would also say, Ken makom sh'ani ohev, sham raglai mochiot oti. So if a place that I love, if there's a place that I truly love, my legs will take me there. My feet will take me there. That is to say that the idea of going home is also an idea that you feel drawn to. That if you really love a place, you'll feel drawn to it. Your legs will take me there. And I know that whenever we're traveling as a family and we go on long journeys, sometimes that last hour on the ride home, you're excited to go home. This past weekend, we were away at Camp Elonim for our Valley Best Shalom Day School Udai family weekend. We had 25 families. We hadn't seen many of them in over a year, and it was really, really wonderful to go away and to not have to cook and not have to clean, but also to learn Torah and be in community and be outside at the beautiful campus of Brandeis Bardeen. But it was also really fun and beautiful and peaceful to come home. And Hillel, I think, says that when he says, Ken makom sha'ani ohev, that place that I really love, sham raglei molech oti. That's the place where I am drawn to. That's the place my feet will come to me. And then we add the spiritual dimension, which, again, this is the introductory text for tonight, is the text that based on the book of Exodus and eventually the book of Isaiah, where we talk about what does it also mean to come home. And here he switches his voice from being the voice of a person to being God's voice. So, and the Holy Blessed One said, God said, Im tavo el beiti, ani avo el beitecha. Im ata lo tavo el beiti, ani lo avo el beitecha. Shene'emar bechol makom asher azkir et shemi, avo elecha uverchotecha. So God says, the Holy Voice says, if you come to my house, I'll come to your house. But if you don't come to my house, I won't come to your house. As it's stated, in every place that I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come and bless you. And here we see the parallel between our home and God's home. God says, in this voice, if you come to my house, I'll come to your house. It's reciprocal. And if you don't come to my house, I won't come to your house. Rather than thinking of this as conditional, however, I want to think about it in terms of our internal thought. If going to your home feels like a dangerous place, either because there's abuse or insecurity, or there doesn't feel like a place of safety, then you won't feel blessed when you're at home. We know that. If you look out at the world and you see a world that is dark and depressed, you'll become dark and depressed. If you look at a world that feels dangerous and you internalize that danger, you'll never feel safe in the world. And so what God is trying to say, what the text is trying to say is, if you find the godliness and you go to those places where God dwells, you will feel blessed by God in those places. If you come to my house, I will go to your house. And remember, this is written after the fall of the temple. So this has to be not physical, but metaphorical. If you come to my house, I'll come to your house. And if you don't, it's because you don't see God in the world, then you won't feel God in the world. And that's the parallel, again, to what Hillel said in the top. Im anikan hakolkan, ve'ein ikan mikan. If I am here and fully present, I feel the presence of everyone around me. But if I'm not present, then I feel that nothing is around me. And so this very first, it's a bit abstract, but this very first idea of home is that home is a place where you feel presence, you feel that you are drawn to it because you love it, and you feel the reciprocal energy of the people around you. Now, for a Jew in diaspora, that can be a challenging thing. For a Jew in diaspora, no matter how good we have it, no matter where we are in the world, how good we have it, home is that place where you feel like you can be a Jew. Home is that place where you feel like you can be a family person. Home is that place where you don't have to be quiet about your Jewish identity. And that is a feeling of what it means to be a minority in a majority culture. I can tell you that when I was a kid, I grew up in Plano, Texas, and at the time there was very, very few Jews around, and the only place that really felt comfortable with who we are and the rhythm of our own lives was either in our home or in the synagogue. And outside, nobody understood us, nobody got us. There was plenty of anti-Semitism where I grew up. Thank God it's different now. But I can tell you that coming home was this feeling of I can be the same person inside that I am outside. And we're going to get to that in a minute as a second aspect of what it means to come home. In the Mishnah, parallel text to the one that we just read, talks about what kind of home we should build. And here, this is a famous from Pirkei Avot. It says, Yossi ben Yozer, ish Tzarda, Yossi ben Yochanan, ish Yerushalayim, Kiblu mehem, Yossi ben Yozer, ish Tzarda, omed, Yehi beitecha beit va'ad l'chachamim, Vahu mitabech afer raglehem, Vahu shotev betzama et divarehem. So Yossi ben Yotzer, from this place called Zereda, and Yossi ben Yochanan, from Jerusalem, received a tradition from Shimon HaTzadik, who has become famous this last week in world affairs. And what they say is, let your house be a house for meeting places for the sages, and sit in the very dust of their feet and drink in their thirst. And of course, it's not trying to denigrate anyone who is a student. It's actually just trying to say, open your house to places of learning. There should be a place in your house that's a public part of your house that teachers can come teach and children can come learn, or any student can come learn. At VBS, we have so many chavarot, even through the pandemic, that continue to try to engage in communal learning. And now that we have online learning together and online abilities to be together, we've never stopped learning and teaching as Jews. And the kind of home that we're trying to build as Jews is one that embodies both learning and teaching. So it's not just a place where you feel like you can be, it's a place where you feel like you can grow. It's a place where you can feel like you can grow in your spirituality, a place where you can grow in your community, and a place where you can grow in your Judaism. So that's, there's one more piece here I want to bring up about the quality of being home, and that is the idea of partnership. And while this is a heteronormative text, a heterosexual text, I also think it applies to any types of family life that you build inside your home. Because the word bayit itself, as again in English, technically means house, but in Hebrew, the word bayit can mean so many other things. So from here in Masechet Shabbat, we learn that Rabbi Yossi said that he always spoke euphemistically. And he says, in all my days, I never called my wife, nor my ox, my ox. Rather, I called my wife my home, because she is the essence of the home, and my ox, my field, because it is the primary force in the fields. And here Rashi says, when it says ishti beiti, shehi ikar shel bait, that she is the ikar, the essence of the home. And over again, the word bayit, the word home, comes to mean not just wife, as it does here, but it comes to mean the entire household. Now, I don't know what you call your ox or what you call, your favorite tractor or what have you. But the truth is that it's not just about, with partnership, it's not just about what they do for you, it's about how they build a life together. I can tell you, and I hope others feel this way too, that building a home, when you build a home, you're hopefully building a household. And for those who have families, understand this, and for those who don't, understand it in a sort of a broader context, that what feels like a home are the people who have your back, the people who understand you intimately, the people who protect you from your own failings and raise you up. And that is what the essence of a home is. And in Jewish literature, the word bayit comes to mean all of those things, not just the physical space that we call home. So I'm going to stop right there, sort of as chapter 1, as we're about 20 minutes in. Happy to open this up for discussion for a moment. I'll stop the screen share so we can all discuss. So what have we learned about a home so far from the Mishnah and the Talmud? We learned that the word home refers to people. We learned that it refers to a sense in the world, how we approach the world, the sense of being comfortable. And we learn that it is a place that we're drawn to. It's a place where we feel like we're heading towards because we love it. But makom sha'ani ohev ragli molachti. So any thoughts or comments on that first section about what it means to be coming home? And then we're gonna take this to the next level in the next section. Happy to entertain. Yeah, Jerry, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I find myself, as I get older, increasingly falling into the role of advocate for the elderly, and I guess I'm identifying with them. But from our generation, meaning my age cohort in the 80s, where we have children and who are middle-aged adults, and we have grandchildren who are young adults. I couldn't pass the Robert Frost definition of what a home is when he said that home is the place where if you need to go there, they have to take you in. And unfortunately, in this age of both coronavirus shutdown and other economic uncertainties, I see a lot of my contemporaries being faced with that, having middle-aged children coming back to the home with their families because they have to. And that's not to say that it's onerous. It's sometimes like a wonderful vacation for everybody. But I think that sometimes the home is strongly and appropriately strongly differentiated from what goes on in the world at large that we find ourselves in, where people in the home don't judge one another, they don't give up on one another, they don't ignore them or take them for granted, and so I think the home is not a mirror of the world necessarily, because to some extent the world is uncertain and perhaps dangerous.
Jerry, I appreciate that, because that will actually help us jump into the second section here in a minute. But just to give you a quick little preview, a home is not meant to mirror the outside world. I don't think that's actually the purpose of a home. The home is to protect you from the outside world. It's the one place where you don't have to put on airs, hopefully. It's the one place where you should feel like you can be your most comfortable self. It's a place where you feel settled. It's a place where you can have a real argument with somebody and you know that you're doing it out of love, and that you don't have to like worry about the political implications of everything that you're saying, right? So that's what a home is. Now, I think that it's not, again, maybe it is a mirror of the world. It's not a window of the world, if I could put it that way. It's the opposite reflection. It's the reflection where right is left and left is right of what's out in the world. And I think for a very long time, Jews, up until 1967 in many places, and I think up until today and still many places, Jews still have to feel they have to be one way outside of the home, outside of our home Jewish communities, and it can be another way inside our home Jewish communities. We've tried so many different times to break that barrier, but the truth is that the world in many ways won't let us. And the only place in the world where we can be that way is a place that's assaulted all the time. And so, and I don't necessarily think that it's unique to the Jewish community to have to do this. This is something that many minorities, racial minorities, ethnic minorities feel in a larger culture, a larger diaspora culture. The sociological term for this in many ways is called code switching, where you operate by one code and set of language internally and another set of code externally. And the way that we can prove this up real quick is that many of us have English names and many of us have Hebrew names. Those are two different languages, and we're called by one in society and we're called by another to the Torah. And that is a version of code switching. Esther, the queen from the Megillah, had two names. She had Hadass, which is her Hebrew name, and Esther is her Persian name. And she had to go by Esther to get what she needed, but by home, she was called Hadass. And we're not the only ones who experience this, but the sense of being home, of being present, of feeling presence, the sense of not having to put on those airs or those other parts of ourselves, that itself is a part of what it means to feel at home and building a home. And what Hillel said in Masechet Sukkah is just, I was just blown away when I read it, right? If I am here, everyone is here. And if I don't feel present, then it doesn't feel like anyone is present. And that a home is a place that I love so much. Makom ani ohev, the ragli molech dioti, right? My legs literally walk me there. They come to my home. It's a really powerful notion. All right, I'm going to share my screen as we move to the second section, and then we'll have a quick discussion about that one too. So what we talked about is what is a home and who are the people that make up our home. The word bayit can be so many other things besides a physical place. It could be the people we love, the partnership we have, the place where we feel most comfortable. But it is also a place that requires our time, our energy, and attention. And for those of us who own homes, we know that it requires not only our time, energy, and attention, but it requires our weekends and evenings to clean out the gutters and take out the trash and fix the doorknobs and to, repair the screens and clean the AC filters. Those are all things that we have to do. But other things we have to do is to make sure that the people in our home feel as protected as we want to feel in our home. And so there's a couple of texts here that I think play on that a little bit. And the value for this is called Shalom bayit, the peace of the home. And the peace of the home are things that we try to do to make sure that we take the interests of other people at least as much as our own, if not actually more than our own. And that we're willing to forego other obligations and other privileges outside the home for the sake of making the people in our home happy. Because having a peaceful home is itself a value. And the first place this comes up is in this discussion about Hanukkah and Shabbat. So Hanukkah, you light candles, and on Shabbat, you light candles. On Hanukkah, we light candles in a Chanukiah, and we have to get oil for that. It's an obligation, and it's a community obligation. It's something that we do outside the home. Even though you light a Chanukiah inside the house, it's supposed to be facing outside. It's showing off to the world the miracle of Hanukkah. So you're required and we're obligated to try to pursue hanes, make the miracle shine out into the world. Counter to that is the idea that on Friday nights, we need to light up our homes with the Shabbos candles, with the lights of Shabbat. One for Zachor and one for Shamor, 2 Shabbos lights. And what happens if you don't have enough money for both? What happens if you have to put those two values against each other, doing something private and doing something public? If you don't do something public, people will ask, well, how come Noah didn't put out his Chanukiah? It's the holiday of the lights. We need to see them. But if you don't do something privately, maybe your family will be upset. So this comes up in the Talmud. And here they basically say, Rava says the question of this is just obvious to me. He says, you buy the oil for the lamp for the home, which is more important than the oil for the lamp of the Hanukkah. And the Shabbat lamp for his home takes precedence. And this is due because of Shalom bayit. This is the first place Shalom bayit is written in rabbinic literature. And the commentator here says, without the light of the lamp, his family would be sitting and eating their meal in the dark, which is a really nice way of blowing over the actual value and just getting to the practicality, eating dinner in the dark. But it's actually, it's much deeper than that. He goes on, similarly, there's a conflict between acquiring oil for the light for one's home and the sanctification of Kiddush for Shabbat. The lamp for his home takes precedence because of peace in his home. So where I think the commentator misses the boat here, it's not just about sitting in the dark. We can all sit in the dark and eat. In fact, you can go to restaurants post-COVID, pre-COVID, whatever, where sitting in the dark to eat is the thing to do. It's like the novel thing to do. And you pay a lot of money to go sit in the dark and eat. It's not about sitting in the dark. It's about knowing the needs of your house and supplying the needs of your house. And if your partner or your kids say, we need oil for the lamp for the house, we're going to do that first before we do it for Hanukkah. So it's not just about eating in the dark. It's about making others happy. It's about affording the opportunity for those in our families' needs to override public needs. So I just want to lay that out as another part of what it was required for building a home. Building a home isn't just about what you get out of it. It's about what you put into it. You have to invest in the relationships of your family, of your friends, whoever is in your home. And that Shalom bayit itself, the idea that you should settle arguments, the idea that you shouldn't press your advantage over people you love, that is important for you to create a peaceful house. It's a place where everyone should feel comfortable, which means that if you get into an argument or your values begin to clash inside your home, you figure out a way to put those values aside enough so you can sit together and that you can be in home, so people can feel home together, that sense of home, that sense of being in our skin and out of our skin simultaneously, that our insides and outsides match each other, and that it's a place where we can be comfortable and safe. And to do that, we have to create Shalom bayit as much as we want to expect Shalom bayit. And this is reflected most theologically on this beautiful text. You know, on every Friday night, we sing Shalom Aleichem. We welcome angels to our table. And in the Babylonian period, they actually had a whole sort of midrash around this. And so Rav Chisda said, and I'll just read this out. Rav Chisda said that Mar Ukva said, one who prays on Shabbat evening, so imagine now you're in the evening prayers for Shabbat, and recites the Vayachulu paragraph, which is out of the book of Breshit, where it says where God completed creation and then blessed Shabbat. Two ministering angels would accompany that person and place their hands on his head and say, and your inquiry has passed and your sin has been atoned. So two angels would come and give you a blessing on Friday night if you quote the Torah, quote the book of Genesis on Friday night. And then it was also taught, this is extended now, where Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, two ministering angels accompany a person on Shabbat evening from the synagogue to their home. One good angel and one evil angel. And when he reaches his home and finds the lamp burning and a table set and his bed made, the good angel says, may it be your will that this shall be like this for another Shabbat, meaning all Shabbat and through the week. And the evil angel has to answer against his own will and say, Amen. And if a person's home isn't prepared for Shabbat in that manner, the evil angel gets to say the same. May it be your will that it shall be prepared for another Shabbat and all week. And the good angel answers against his will and say, Amen. Okay, so here, again, I'm going to leave the paternalism and misogyny aside for a second and just say, if you put the work in to make Shabbat, if you have the oil or the candles, if you have a house that's clean, if you've done the cooking, whoever it is, then that creates the tone for the rest of your week and the rest of your family to the next Shabbat. And if you don't do that, if you don't put that energy in to create Shalom bayit, to create a peaceful, tranquil part of your home where everyone feels safe and comfortable, then your house won't feel comfortable or tranquil or peaceful. Again, going back to Hillel, who said, Im ani kan, hakol kan, im eini kan, mikan. If I am here and present, everyone feels present. And if I'm not present, who feels present? No one feels present. So I'm going to stop there and talk. This section is about what effort it takes to create a home, and let people share and reflect on the second section before we move it now more to a national level. So these first two sections were very personal. We're going to move it to a national level. So any questions, comments, thoughts about what it takes to build a home, not just a house, but to build a home, and the concept of Shalom bayit. Good. Oh, Jerry, I mean, you're welcome to make a comment if you want, and
okay,
then we'll move on.
Yeah, just a quick one, which is, I was struck in the first part of your comments about prioritizing between communal obligations and expectations and the people that you live with in your home. And I guess, again, looking at our current situation with COVID, one of the heart-wrenching things is that the people that we feel most gratitude towards, the first line defenders, the healthcare defenders, the public peace defenders, the emergency responders, etc. The stories that you hear about them are all about, some of them take hotel rooms because they don't want to risk their family, and some of them change clothes in the garage and immediately go into the shower and bag their clothes and so forth. And I think, I don't mean to get especially personal, but I think that the teachers and rabbis like yourself, who are also parents, isn't that a conflict? I mean, most businessmen of my generation, there was no conflict. We went to the office, period. And if we were lucky, we had wives who would do what they could to repair that situation for your mutual children. But
yeah, I appreciate that, Jerry. I think actually, just to take it to the next step here, is I think that COVID has done two things. It has created some of the conflicts that you're talking about especially for first responders and healthcare professionals not being able to be home because they were worried about infecting their own family. But what we're also finding coming out of COVID, as COVID is now beginning to wane, at least we hope, because of vaccinations and other things, is that the work-life balance of life has been called into question altogether. And in negative ways and positive ways. So in negative ways, there never seems to be a time when there isn't work. Work starts at whatever time you wake up and ends when you go to sleep. However, at the same time, we're going to see, and we're already beginning to see this, a large number of Americans moving out of whatever house or apartment or what have you where they're currently living because they had to be physically close to work to another place where they feel like they have a better work-life scenario, whether it's in a vacation area that's very beautiful, or it's out in the suburbs where they can afford a home because they can now own a larger piece of property and pay less for it and commute virtually to work. And you're also finding people that are changing the dynamic. So you said men in your generation would just go to work. Men in my generation are not. Men in my generation are choosing a different work-life balance. And because they recognize that they doesn't have the way that, no offense, but the way that you did it affected their lives very negatively, they think. So they're trying to effectuate a different work-life balance. I want to be there for the games. I want to be there for the programs. I want to be there on the weekends. And if it means I earn a little bit less money, then it means I earn a little bit less money. But COVID has proven that might not be the case, that you can actually do both or all three. You can have everything if you craft it. And again, I think that's the point of this second section, is that to craft a community, to craft a home, requires a lot of intention. And so when we go from the family piece, where we're just we need to make each other feel comfortable, we have to invest our time, our energy, our resources into building a home, to begin to extend it to the community piece. Then how we talk to each other as Jews, how we make time for each other as Jews, how we build our community centers, both physically and spiritually as Jews, that's incredibly important. And when we're thinking about this past week and the continued violence in Israel, there are Jews who forgot how to talk to other Jews because they disagree with whatever's happening. There are Jews who just want to cancel other Jews, so to speak, because they vehemently disagree with whatever was written or posted or said in a conversation. And I understand the difficulty of that we're very passionate about our beliefs. But I also understand very deeply that if you want Shalom bayit, even if you disagree, you can't disagree in a way that destroys another human being. And I think that is something that all of us need to learn, no matter what our opinions are about the particular violence and terrorism that's going on right now. Even there are people that I deeply, deeply disagree with their approach. And I'm willing to have tough conversations with them, but I'm not willing to destroy them in the process because they're Jews. And the worst thing that can come between Jews is another Jew. And I don't want to let that happen. So that's going to move us to the community conversation. So let's take a look now as I share my screen. Let's talk about national home for a minute. So in the book of Isaiah, God is a universalist. There's no question about that. God is a universalist in the book of Isaiah. God becomes not just the God of Abraham and a particular family, not just the God of the people of Israel in the book of Exodus, not just a God living in Jerusalem in the book of Deuteronomy. By the time you get to Isaiah, God is the creator of the world. The whole world is in God's hand. The world is God's footstool. God basically puts his feet up on the world when he's lounging around on a Sunday night. And here, the temple is seen as a symbol for all people to interact with God. And this is a very famous chapter of Isaiah 56. He says, V'haviotim el har kodshi, v'simchati beit tfilati olehem, v'zavchehem l'ratzon al mizbech ki beiti beit tfilah yikareh lechol amim. I'll bring them to my sacred mount, and I'll let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall welcome on my altar, for my house shall be called a house for prayer for all peoples. The idea is that the ultimate home, God's home in the world, is a place where all people can come, open on all sides, and that they would hope they would come to realize the oneness that connects all of us. And that our way of doing it, the Jewish way, the historic way of doing it, is the mode that we want to teach other people to, not necessarily to coerce them, but to invite them and to be a beit tfilati for all people. And so when you begin to shift the idea of home from our most intimate selves, this idea that it's a place where I feel fully present, to a place where we create space for each other to be fully present, now we go to the widest part where we try to create the oneness, the idea of open-endedness, where we all can feel very present. And in the building of that, there's a couple of texts I want to share with you. The first, it's a little bit esoteric, but it's totally worth it. It's from Masechet Brachot, and it talks about the person who was the first human being to build God's home. So lest you think it was King David on the Temple Mount, or King Solomon on the Temple Mount around 2, or Herod in round 2.5, right? That each one of the big temples in Jerusalem were really later editions of God's home. The very first human being to create God's home, his name was Bezalel, and his name meant in the shadow of God. And he was given 2 different commandments in 2 different places in the book of Exodus to talk about what it means to build God's home. And so this is a little esoteric, but I think it's so poetic and beautiful and helps us begin to think about what does it take to build a home for God. It's worth looking at. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Yonatan said, Bezalel was called by the account of his wisdom, of his chokhmah. And when the Holy One, blessed be God, said to Moses, go to Bezalel, make a tabernacle, the Mishkan, an ark, an Aron, and the Kelim. So that is from chapter 31. Make the Mishkan, Aron, Kelim. But when Moses went and told Bezalel, Moses reversed the order and said, make the ark, the vessels, and the tabernacle. Aron, Kelim, the Mishkan. If you look, it's from a different chapter in Exodus. All right, so the fact that they're slightly reversed has a lot to do with the order of the Torah. This whole section of the Torah is considered to be a little mixed up in terms of its storytelling, what came first and what came second. But what's important for this question is, do you build a home from the outside in? From the Mishkan first, the actual outer walls, then the ark, and then the vessels? Or, as Moses reversed it, do you build it from the inside out? The ark, the vessels, and then the tabernacle. Does everyone see that? That's the problem. They thought this was in order. So build the Mishkan, the ark, and the vessels versus the ark, the vessels, and the tabernacle. So just to close out the sugya, he said to Moses, our teacher, the standard practice throughout the world is that a person builds a house and only after places the vessels in the house. Most people, when they buy a house, they're going to buy the house, measure the walls, and then figure out if they need different furniture, buy new furniture to go into that house. That's what makes sense. But if you say to me, then make an ark, a vessels, and a tabernacle, the ark being where we hold the tablets, the vessels, all the tools and implements for sacrifices, the cloths, all of that stuff, and then the tabernacle. You do so if you do so in order you have commanded that the vessels that I make, where shall I put them? What do you do if you make a holy ark and a bunch of vessels and you have no place to put them? Because they got to be put in a temple. So you just kind of put them in storage for a year while you're building the house? That doesn't make any sense. So perhaps God told you the following: make a tabernacle, ark, and vessels. Maybe God said from the outside in, and Moses said to Bezalel, perhaps you were in God's shadow, Bezalel, and you knew precisely what God said. You intuited God's command just as he stated them, as if you were there. That is to say that Moses got it wrong, and Bezalel probably understood it from outside in. Except that is a wonderful midrash that the rabbis bring. I'd like to reverse it. Let's say that Bezalel knew that we wanted to build the ark and the vessels and only then the tabernacle. How does that change our concept of what it means to build a home? Do you start by building the borders and the outside and say, this is the inside and that's the outside, everyone else get out and everything inside is in? Or do you do what Bezalel actually heard from Moshe, in which case you build the sacred things first and you worry about the outside pushing people out at the end? And the obvious parallel is between deciding what the borders of Israel should be versus what kind of people Jews should be. Which comes first? Do you build the Jews first or do you build the borders first? Conflict that still exists today, and something that I keep thinking about when I read this text. How do you build a home? By drawing the borders and telling everyone who's outside that borders you're out and building all of that, or building the character of the people who are inside first. Of course, it's not a zero-sum conversation, but those conflicts should exist and that conversation should happen. And the last text I'll teach tonight, and then we'll open it up for one more round of discussion, is how you remember the destruction of the temple. Because we know the temple was destroyed. And here at the very end of Bava Vatra, which is the last section on torts, on when people get injured and sue each other in the Talmud, they take us in a different direction, and they talk about what it means to mourn the loss of a temple. So the sages taught in a baraita that when the temple was destroyed the second time, there was an increase in the number of ascetics among Jews, whose practice was not to eat meat or not to drink wine. And Rabbi Yeshua, who was a Levi, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, was a Levi, joined them. And he said to them, my children, for what reason do you not eat meat or drink wine? And they said to him, well, shall we eat meat for which the offerings are sacrificed upon the altar now that the altar has ceased to exist? How can we eat meat? We're supposed to eat meat based on the sacrifices. We don't have that access anymore. Well, shall we drink wine, which is poured as a libation upon the altar? And now that the altar has ceased to exist, same thing for the wine. So Rabbi Yeshua said to them, if so, then we shouldn't eat bread, since bread was part of the meal offering, and those have ceased. And the students said, yeah, you're right. That's right. We shouldn't eat bread. How can, but then he says, is it possible to subsist without produce? And he said to them, well, we won't eat produce either, since bringing of the first fruits has ceased. No more fruits, no more vegetables. So we've cut out wine and meat, bread and veggies. We will no longer eat the produce, they said, of the 7 species that were supposed to be brought. And is it possible to subsist with the other produce? And he said to them, well, then maybe we shouldn't drink water, since water was a libation that has ceased. Because even from our first text, the holiday of drawing out water was used on the altar as a special water holiday for Sukkot called Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Well, that's over, so we shouldn't drink water either. So we're not supposed to drink wine, eat meat, eat veggies, eat bread, or drink water. So they were silent, obviously, and they realized that they couldn't survive without the water. So Rabbi Yeshua said to them, my children, come. I will tell you how we should act. To not mourn at all is impossible, as the decree was already issued. The temple's been destroyed. But to mourn excessively, as you are doing so, is also impossible. As the sages say, do not issue a decree upon the public unless the majority of the public is able to abide by it. As it is written, You are cursed with a curse, yet you rob me even of the whole nation. Rather, this is what the sages said. A person may plaster his house with plaster, but leave a small amount without plaster to remember the destruction of the temple. And we know that this is a practice for thousands of years in the Jewish community. You could go to someone's house in the Middle East and you would see their walls were plastered, painted white, but there might be a small section somewhere that was left unplastered. And it says, anyone who mourns for the destruction of Jerusalem will merit and see joy. As it stated, rejoice with Jerusalem. But it's also taught in the Braita, the Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha said, from the day the temple was destroyed by right, we should decree upon ourselves not to eat meat or drink wine. But the sages do not issue a decree upon the public unless a majority of the public is able to abide by it, which is what we just learned. And from the day the wicked kingdom of Rome spread, whose decree and harsh decrees upon us to nullify the Torah and to perform the mitzvot for us, we do not allow us to enter the celebration the first week of a son, i.e. circumcision, and to enter the celebration of salvation, the first one, Pidyon Haben. And by right, we should each decree upon ourselves not to marry a woman or to produce offspring, and turn out the descendants of Abraham, our forefather, would cease on their own. Using a similar argument that Rabbi Yeshua used earlier, said, just because life is really difficult, don't think that we should stop circumcising our children, doing Pidyon Haben, marrying our children off, celebrating life. Just because life seems difficult and sad, that we should stop being Jewish. It says, but concerning a situation such as this, then we should say, leave the Jews alone and do not impose decrees by which they cannot abide. It's better that they be unwitting sinners who do not know that what they're doing is improper, considering all these circumstances, and not be intentional wrongdoers. That is to say, let's not be so harsh on each other. It's better that people who screw up this way, that way, one way, another way, it's better that they do that than be so harsh on ourselves as to keep Jews from being Jewish. So what do we learn in this third section? What do we learn in this third section? We talk about that our national home, the home for God, the Beit HaMikdash, was supposed to be a Jewish way of celebrating religious life, and that it should be home open to people. But in the building of that home, there's a tension between setting the borders, building the outside, and then worrying about the inside, versus building the inside and then worrying about the outside. And that is a live tension that exists today. And then finally, even as we mourn the destruction of the temple, and even as we live and rebuild a state in the shadow of that temple, we have to realize that we have to create a Judaism in which people can abide, that people have to be able to live by it. And that even if some things don't feel right, or they feel a little bit off, for the sake of Shalom Bayit, we have to build it up, because we cannot abide separation between one Jew and another. And so before we close this out, any closing comments or thoughts on either section 3 itself or sections 1, 2, and 3 before I make a quick closing? Doug, I see you.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
In that last text, they were talking about a majority that had to be able to abide by it. Is that really saying that, that Judaism has become a sort of majority rule in terms of how we live our life and our laws? I mean, the religion as opposed to just, the politics of a state? Is that really what it is these days?
I think it's always been that way. And that the Sanhedrin voted on cases just like the Supreme Court today kind of votes and writes opinions on cases, and that dictated how we've been. That's how that dictates what God's will is, and even more so than what they think the Constitution said. It dictated God's will. And the idea that, for example, I'll give you another example. I grew up and went to rabbinical school, and I learned that you have to sign the ketubah on the same night that you do a wedding. Okay? That's the custom I learned. But we have Persian Jews in our midst who don't have that custom. And one of the reasons why they don't have that custom is because they have different familial customs between what groom's parents and bride's parents take care of, etc. And the ketubah ceremony has its own energy around it based on those different. So even though that's actually not the halacha. That's actually not what you're supposed to do. You can't post-date a check in Jewish life. So you can't post-date a ketubah in Jewish life. We do it because that's what they abide by. And that's actually beginning to permeate the Ashkenazi community as we become more integrated and more overlapping in our minhagim, which I find utterly fascinating and actually wonderful in certain ways. Other examples I'm sure I can think of, but that we've changed over time. If we can no longer abide, I mean, it's one of the reasons why I think the driving tshuva was written. I think there's a few other tshuvot along the way that were written. Like it's a perfect example of if a poor person and a rich person came to a rabbi with the same chicken and you knew the chicken wasn't kosher. According to Jewish law, you tell the rich person the chicken isn't kosher and you tell the poor person the chicken is kosher. Why? Because it's not just about the science of the thing. It's about the people who practice the thing. It's not just about the science of kashrut. It's about the Jews who practice the kashrut. And we've always had that. Rav Soloveitchik, in several of his books, but including Halachic Man, even writes about this. And I'm not Orthodox, but he was the head of YU for a really long time. That there's a situational sociological halacha that's separate from the strict positivist version of halacha. And so when we're talking about building, it's because we try to build a home for Jews to be comfortable.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up the concept of kashrut, because if you're saying a majority can abide by it, I think you'd show that in any statistical thing with Jews is that a majority of Jews don't keep kosher. So is that now okay because a majority doesn't abide by it? I think that goes a little too far, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess I could say two answers at once are probably self-contradictory, Doug. One is, I don't judge Jews who don't keep kosher.
I don't either. I just
right. So like you take I'm not saying you do, but like the end of Baba Batra, right? Better that they be sinners and we don't bother them too much about it than make them feel like they're living in sin every single day. Secondarily, I think there would be a lot more Jews who kept kosher if keeping kosher was easier. And I don't mean necessarily just about washing and milk and meat. I actually mean about prices and the people who control kashrut. And I would love to have a more free market system around kashrut. And that's like a little bit taking us a little bit far afield from tonight's topic. But the idea that Jewish law and Jewish custom is really about building a home, and that God can't be too far away from the needs of human beings, and that Jewish laws have to follow the nape of Jewish life. And if we don't do that, then we're no longer building Judaism that makes sense to a lot of people. And as a rabbi who cares very much about drawing people closer to Judaism, I don't want to keep moving the goalposts back. I'd rather keep moving them closer so that people feel the joy of Jewish life like I do. So thank you, Doug, for that question. So just to conclude tonight, we did 3 sections on home to set us up for our next session. The first is about what it feels like to be home, that you feel comfortable, you feel presence, you feel like you live in your own skin, that there's no difference between the outside of ourselves and the inside of ourselves. The second is that it takes a lot of energy, a lot of energy to build a home, to create Shalom bayit. You have to put the needs of others over ourselves, maybe even balance the needs of a home over our public needs, and that you're supposed to put the work in. And if you put that work in, hopefully you'll get the blessings coming out. And then the third, as we go to the communal and national level, there are questions about, and I think wonderful teachings about, what it takes to build a national home and what it takes to build a national home as a Jewish community. How do we put our energy into each other? How do we put the reciprocal energy in? How do we talk to each other as Jews, even if we completely disagree with each other? And if we take those values, we can hopefully build a home for ourselves, a home for our nation, and a home for God. Thank you all for joining me tonight. I'm happy to, if you want to send me a text or an email, happy to send you the actual texts so you can keep it. And I'll turn it over to Rabbi Feinstein, who is with us this evening, and Cantor Barron to lead us in Mariv before we go to our next study session.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was wonderful. And so enjoy your learning. Cantor Baron, you here?
I am.
Where you are, okay. Well, everyone, good evening. Chag Sameach. It's wonderful to be together again. I'm going to ask the cantor to lead us through the Mariv prayers, and at the end, we'll make a little kiddush together, and then we'll continue our learning. Cantor, you're up.
And we begin Mariv on page 28. Please rise. Baruch et Adonai Hamevorach Baruch Adonai Hamevorach Hamevorach Leolam Vaed Hamevorach Hamevorach Leolam Vaed Baruch Adonai Hamevorach Leolam Vaed. And you may be seated. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Umamire yom umevi layla, umamdil ben yom uven layla, Adonai tzvahot shemo, El chai v'kayam tamid yimloch aleinu leolam vaed, Baruch atah Adonai, Hamari v'aravim, Ahavat olam, Beit Yisrael, Amchamta, Torah u'mitzvot, Chokim u'mishpatim, Otanu limadta. Al kein Adonai Eloheinu, V'shochveinu, Uvekumenu, Nasiach Mechukecha, V'nismach V'divrei Toratecha, U'mitzvotecha, Leolam Vaed, Ki hem chayenu, Ve'orech yameinu, Ovahem nege yomam v'layla, Ki hem chayenu, ve'orech yameinu, Ovahem nege yomam v'layla, Ki hem chayenu, ve'orech yameinu, Ovahem nege yomam v'layla, Ki hem chayenu, ve'orech yameinu, Ovahem nege yomam v'layla, Ki hem chayenu, ve'orech yameinu, Ovahem nege yomam v'layla, Ki hem chayenu, ve'orech yameinu, Ovahem nege yomam v'layla. Ve'avadecha tasir mimenu leolamim, Baruch atah Adonai, Ohev amo Yisrael. Let's join together for Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, bechol levavcha, uvechol nafshecha, uvechol meodecha, ve'hayu ha'devarim ha'ele, Asher Anochi mitzavecha, hayom alevavecha, ושיננתם לבניך, ודיברת בם, ושבתך בביתך, ובלכתך בדרך, ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך, ובישעריך. Please continue silently or join me on the top of page 31. ויאמר אדוני אל משה לאמור, דבר אל בני ישראל, ואמרת עליהם, ויעשו להם ציצית על כנפי בגדיהם לדורותם, ונתנו על ציצית הכנף בטיל תכלת, והיה לכם לציצית, הוריתם אותו, וזכרתם את כל מצוות אדוני, ועשיתם אותם, ולא תתורו אחרי לבבכם, ואחרי עיניכם, אשר אתם זונים אחריהם, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אדוני אלוהיכם, אמת. We're on page 32. ומלכותו ורצון קיבלו עליהם משה בני ישראל, ניחנו שירה בשמחה רבה, ואמרו כולם, מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש, נורא תהילות, עושה פלא, עושה פלא. Yada dai 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 yada dai 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 yada dai 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 yada dai 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 yada dai 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 ai dai 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 מלכותך רעו בניך בוקע ים לפני משה מלכותך רעו בניך בוקע ים לפני משה זה לי אנו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם לעולם ועד Yada day 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 yada day 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 yada day 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 yada day 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 yada day 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 yada day 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 yada day 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 ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב וגאלו מיד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל השכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו לשלום והעמידנו מלכנו לחיים ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך ותקננו בעצה טובה מלפניך והושיענו למען שמך והגן בנינו ועשר מעלינו אויב דבר וחרב ורעל ויגון ועשר שטן מלפנינו ומאחרינו ובצל כנפיך תסתירנו כי אל שומרנו מצילנו אתה כי אל מלך חנון ורחומתו, ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום. מעתה ועד עולם, ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך. ברוך אתה אדוני, הפורש סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ועל ירושלים. וידבר משה את מועדי אדוני אל בני ישראל. We're on page 34. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי כל בית ישראל, בגלה בגלה ובזמן קריב ויאמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה יתברך. יתברך וישתבח ויתבהר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי לקודשא בריחו לעילה מן כל ברכתיו ושירתו, תושבחתה בנחמתה דמירן בעלמא ויאמרו אמן. And take a few moments of silent prayer. The Amidah begins on page 35. And that's a correction. It's page 41 for the Chag. Adonai hus le'amo yitein Adonai yivarech amo Adonai hus le'amo yitein Adonai yivarech et amo Shalom, Shalom. Adonai hos le'amo yitein Adonai yivarech et amo. Adonai hos le'amo yitein Adonai yivarech et amo Shalom Kaddish Shalom is on page 48. Yitkanav yikara shemei rabba Behalma dimrakinu tevyamlik malchutei Bechayechon uvyamechon cherchol beit Yisrael Bagala uvizman kari vahimaro Yehi shmei rabba mevorach Le'olam u'lalmei almaya Yitbarach v'yishtamach V'yitpar v'yitshomam yenaseh V'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shemei dekudisha Brichu Leyl min kol birchata v'shirata Tushbechata v'nechemata Damiran v'yama v'himaro Tikabal tzur horvat chol Yisrael Kodam avanim ishmaya v'himaro Yehei shlama rabba min shamaya v'chayim Aleinu vel kol Yisrael v'himaro Ose shalom bimromav Uyase shalom Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'himaro Amen. Ask you to rise and turn to page 50 if you have the blue siddur for the Kiddush, for the festival. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei peri hagafen Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Asher bachar banu mikol ha'am Veromemanu mikol lashon V'kiddishanu b'mitzvotav V'titen lanu Adonai Eloheinu be'ahava Moadim lesimcha Chagim ozmanim l'sason Et yom chag hashavuot hazeh Zeman matan torateinu mikra kodesh Zecher litziat Mitzrayim Kivanu v'acharta Ve'otanu kinashta mikol ha'amim Umoadei kodshecha B'simcha v'sason Hinchaltanu Baruch atah Adonai Mekadesh Yisrael V'ha'almanim. L'chaim, everyone. And stay on your feet if you would. Oh, Rabbi Feinstein is here. Hello, Rabbi. How am I doing? Okay. All right, great. Aleinu, page 51. Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol לתת גדולה ליוצא בראשית שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה שלא שם חלקנו כהם וגורלנו ככל המונם ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא שהוא נוטה שמיים ויסר הארץ אדוני אלוהינו ככתוב בתורתך אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו
Thank you, Cantor, for your davening. Before we conclude our service, we invite everyone who's reciting Kaddish in memory of a loved one or observance of a yard site. This is a chance to say Kaddish together. So you're welcome to rise and to join together in words of memory. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, v'yalma divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon v'yomechon, u'v'chayei dechal beit Yisrael bagalav v'zman kariv v'yibrameh. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam ol me'omaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shemei dekut shabrichu. Leyl min kol berchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata. Damiran be'alma v'yimru amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Yishkoach Cantor, thank you, and thank you to Rabbi Farkas for teaching in our first hour. So at this point, if we were together in the shul, and God willing, by next year we'll be together in the shul, we would break for a few moments now, and we would all go get ice cream. Thank you to Alana Zimmerman for providing wonderful snacks, and particularly she's been really good at getting ice cream over these last years. That's become a New Valley Beth Shalom tradition. I believe it goes back to the giving of Torah on Mount Sinai. When Moses went up to the mountain, the people of Israel bided their time at the bottom of the mountain, eating dishes and dishes of ice cream. And that's the way we look, the way that we look. So let's do this. I want to give everyone a chance to do that. So we learned for an hour with the rabbi, and we daven with the cantor. Let's take a 5-minute break, 5 minutes, 5-minute break. Everyone run to the restroom if you need the restroom, run to your kitchen and get a dish of ice cream, get a quick snack, a cup of coffee, and we're gonna continue now. It's 8:23. We'll continue at 8:28. Back right here for the second hour of our learning. We're going to be talking about homecoming, particularly with reference to the land of Israel and the birth of Zionism, and how Zionism was a species of Jewish homecoming and anti-homecoming. Well, we'll talk about that in just a few moments. So everybody go get some ice cream. 5 minutes, we'll be right back. Those of you on Facebook and YouTube, go get some ice cream. I promise you we're not going to go anywhere. We'll be right here when you get back. Okay? Everybody go. This is your big chance. Go, go, go. Go, go, go. This is it.
Thanks, Alana.
My pleasure, always.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. Hope you've had a little ice cream and a cup of coffee and ready to continue learning. The tradition is we do this all night, which takes a lot of fortitude. So we'll go a little bit later in the evening and see how we do. So it's wonderful to be together. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing our evening of learning, and thank you to the rabbi and the cantor for leading us tonight. So as most of you, my thoughts have been really glued to Israel these last days, and so terribly worried about what's going on, and so terribly perplexed about how it got to this, and whether and reading various analyses here and there. So what we thought we'd do is take that basic idea, take the idea of homecoming, which is so important to us at this moment as this pandemic begins to wane, and look at it in the context of the Zionist movement. So for 2,000 years, Jews said at the end of every Passover, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. For 2,000 years, at the end of every Yom Kippur, we said L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. For 2,000 years, we included in our prayers the words V'techazena einenu b'shuvcha l'tzion b'rachamim. Let our eyes behold a return to Zion, your return, God's return to Zion. For 2,000 years, we dreamed of going back, but we never went. It's kind of an irony, when people didn't go, because for most of those 2,000 years, the land of Israel, the city of Jerusalem, ceased to be a place, ceased to be a geographic location, and instead became an abstraction. It became a symbol for a great dream of a redeemed world. And when we said L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, we didn't mean we were actually going to pick up and go to Jerusalem. What it meant was that a world would be redeemed. And as part of the overall redemption of the world, the arrival of a Messiah, God's judgment of the world, Jews would return to their land, Jews would return to their place. It wasn't until the late 19th century when Jews began to take seriously the idea of actually going to Israel. And that is, it took 19th century modern Jews, particularly a Jew who was somewhat distanced from Judaism, from the tradition of Judaism, named Theodor Herzl, to identify the land of Israel as a place that had a politics, and that through the power of politics, we could regain control of that place and actually go back. And it's one of the great ironies of Jewish history that it took a Jew who was separated from Judaism to be able to bring us back to our own homeland. And at that moment, at the end of the 19th century, there were two historic movements, two remarkable moments in the history of Jewish ideas. In Eastern Europe, we had the idea of the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. Jews began to want to break out of the intellectual boundaries of traditional Judaism and begin to think like Europeans, to begin to think European kinds of thoughts. And among those European kind of thoughts was the notion of the Jewish people as a people, and as a Jewish people as a people with the potential for political power and ultimately even maybe political sovereignty. And in Western Europe, where Jews had been emancipated already and were somewhat distanced from tradition, what happened in Western Europe was the realization that emancipation, that is the welcoming of Jews into secular European society, wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. It was supposed to make us equals. It was supposed to grant us full and equal civil rights, but it couldn't do that because the anti-Semitism of European cultures was so deep, was so deeply rooted in European cultures and frankly in European Christianity, that Jews would never be counted as equals. That is, emancipation was a lie, that we could talk like Frenchmen, we could behave like Englishmen, we could participate in the culture like Germans, we could walk about dressed like Austrians, we could participate like Italians, and yet none of those cultures would fully welcome us in. So the coincidence of the failure of emancipation in the West and the stifling isolation and the stifling, stultifying life of the intellectual life in Eastern Europe brought forth a movement at the end of the 19th century called Zionism. And what Zionism promised was a return. And that was the language. Not a going to, but a return to. And the language of return is very important because it was a return home. A return home, except for this. It was a return home, but it was also a breakaway. And that's the irony that I'd like to point out for you tonight. That Zionism, that Israel, is at the same time a homecoming and a revolt against that home. A homecoming that was long, deeply, deeply rooted in our culture and long awaited by Jews. And at the same time, a revolution, a real ideological revolution from that same culture and that same tradition. My teacher, David Hartman, used to put it this way, that Zionism is the equivalent of the kid who has an argument with his parents and declares, I'm leaving home, I'm never coming back, walks out the front door, slams the door, crosses the street, and moves in with his grandparents. It is at the same time a running away from home and a coming back to home. A running away from what was in Jewish life, but a returning to a land and to a set of ideas which are deeply rooted in Jewish culture. I'd like to point that out tonight in a series of texts, but I decided tonight not to do the normal ones. I mean, normally you know me and you know Rabbi Farkas and you know how much we love philosophical texts and ideological texts, but tonight we're going to do something different. It's also getting late. So tonight we're going to do literature. And I want to do literature for a couple of reasons. One is because I think it reflects these ideas in a very much more powerful way than philosophical texts, because literature isn't bound by the same consistency that we demand of philosophy. And second, because it reflects, I think, the deeper inner life of the Zionist movement and then ultimately of Israelis, this homecoming and revolt against home at the same time. And I'd be glad to share the worksheet with you after the session, but let's take a look first. So we'll go somewhat chronologically. The first song I'd like to learn with you is the one all of you know. It's the words to Hatikva. It was originally written in 1878 by Naftali Tzvi Imber. It was put to the music we know, and the music is a Central European folk song that shows up, for example, in a piece of music called the Moldau. Bum, 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 bum. It's not originally Jewish. It's a Central European folk song. But the poem wasn't originally meant to be the national anthem for anything, but it was an expression of late 19th century Zionism, or rather early political Zionism. So let's look at the words. Some of you know this by heart, I'm sure. Kolod balevav penima nefesh Yehudi homia ulefate mizrach kadima ayin litzion Sophia. One thing I want to point out is that the word Israel doesn't exist doesn't appear in the anthem, and the whole thing is one long sentence. It's one long Hebrew sentence. And here's the basic idea. As long as the Jewish spirit is yearning deep in the heart, with eyes turned toward the east, looking toward Zion, then our hope, the 2,000-year-old hope, will not be lost, to be a free people, Liotam Chofshi Be'artzenu, in our land, Be'eretz Sion Yerushalayim. Now listen to what he's saying, something very interesting. And listen to the way that is a reflection of the deepest truth of the Jewish tradition, but in some ways a very deep break from it. As long as the Jewish spirit is yearning deep in the heart, with eyes turned toward the east, toward Zion, then our hope has not been lost. Where is his hope? Is his hope in Torah? Is his hope in the chosenness of the Jewish people? Is his hope in the revelation of Torah, that today's Shavuot after all? His hope is in Zion, in Israel. Looking toward the east becomes the principal gesture of connection with the Jewish people. Now that is certainly derived from the deepest life of the Jewish people, and yet look at the way that he sort of organizes it. Normally we would think that, well, Torah is what connects us to the deepest parts of ourselves. God, our worship of God, God's choosing of the Jewish people, the life of mitzvah, the life of mitzvot. These are the things that gather us into a people. In fact, we know this in halakha. You know, if you're davening anywhere in the world and you have to say the Amidah, you turn toward the east, with one exception, except if there's a Torah in the room. And if there's a Torah in the room, you turn toward the Torah. You turn toward the ark, which is why at Valley Beth Shalom, because for some reason they built it facing south. That's the direction we pray, because that's where the ark is. Now, the ark should be on the eastern wall, but it's not. It's on the southern wall. But that's where you turn toward. Now, so the tradition said, no, you turn toward the Torah. And Ingber, this is his revolt, you see. His revolt, his revolution from the Jewish, from the corpus of Jewish tradition is no, you turn toward the east, toward Zion, toward Jerusalem. That's the deepest connection of our tradition, of our faith. Let's take another look. Chaim Nachman Bialik, raised in Lithuania, educated in the Volozhin Yeshiva in Lithuania, comes to Odessa to write Hebrew poetry and Hebrew prose, one of the first great masters of Hebrew writing. One of his early poems is called To the Bird, Elat Sipur. It's the poem that every Israeli school kid has to memorize, and therefore every Israeli school kid hates. But it's one of the earliest texts of Zionism. And take a look with me at this. It's a wonderful poem, and we'll give the context in a moment. Greetings to you, kind bird, upon your return from the hot lands back to my window, back to your pleasing voice. My soul perishes in the winter when you leave. Sing, tell me, my beautiful bird, about the wonders of the distant land. Is it full of evils and hardship also? There in the hot, beautiful land, will you bring me regards from my brothers in Zion, from my brothers far and near? So what's the image here? The image is a Eastern European yeshiva boy, pale of skin, spending hours and hours and hours in the yeshiva, poring over his books. You know, he goes over to the window to get a little bit of light, just a little bit of sunlight before the sun eclipses, because he lives far in the north, and in the wintertime it's so dark and it gets dark early in the day, and he's used to the cold and dark. And he's living in a Russia, 1891 is a Russia which is already tormented by pogroms. And a bird, a migratory bird, comes and lands on the windowsill. And he imagines that this bird is who? That this bird is an ambassador. This bird is a herald coming from the east, coming from Israel, from the warmth and the sunlight and the joy and the freedom of the land of Israel. And as he's focused on the bird, instead of the book in front of him, instead of the Talmud in front of him, his soul opens up. Greetings to you, kind bird, upon your return from the hot lands back to my window. Back to your pleasing voice. My soul perishes in the winter when you leave. Sing, tell me, my beautiful bird, about the wonders of that distant land. Is it also filled with evil and hardship? Or is it the beautiful dream that we all learned about? When you bring me regards from my brothers in Zion, from my brothers far and near. Oh, happy are they. Do they know how I suffer? Oh, suffer from grief. Do they know how many accusers I have here? How many, so many rise up against me? Sing, my bird, of the wonders of the land. The spring is coming, but to stay forever. Will you bring me from the bounty of the land, from the valleys and the ravines, from the mountaintops? So is the land for him a real place? Yes, it's a place of warmth. It's a place of valleys and of green, of outside, an outside that he doesn't know because he spends all of his time in the yeshiva over books. And yet it is a real place. Has God had compassion? Has God comforted Zion? Or is she still left to graves? And it goes on for several verses. And I gave you, this is the last of the verses. It's very sad. As the bird takes flight and flies away from the window, the poor yeshiva boy begins to weep, right? My eyes have grown dim, a sack filled with tears. Sounds like Echaz. Sounds like Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah in the book of Lamentation. My heart has been struck like a weed. Now the tears and the bruises have stopped, but the end of my sorrow has not yet come. Greetings, my dear bird, upon your return. Oh, please cry aloud for joy. I mean, the longing, you hear the longing there? The longing from release from the persecution, the longing from release from the cold, the longing from release of the bondage of this culture that has held him, the hopefulness, the powerful hopefulness. This is what Zionism meant to Eastern European Jews. This is what Zionism represented. Now, the irony of this coming home, the longing, the far away, the sense of being far away, is captured in a piece of literature that was published in 1925, but became an instant classic. It's a beautiful, beautiful story by Shmuel Yosef Agnon. Agnon also was a Lithuanian yeshiva boy. But Agnon, like Bialik, actually made it to Israel. Bialik made it to Israel, but died in 1934. Agnon went on living for quite a while longer and became Israel's great novelist, won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And Agnon writes a little teeny story called The Fable of the Goat. Now, I got to warn you something about Agnon and something about Bialik. The English language, last time I looked, has about 600,000 words. The Hebrew language has about 20,000 words. That is, Hebrew is a much narrower language in terms of its range of expression than English or French or any of the great European languages. But so the way that these authors, particularly these early Hebrew authors, worked was by using words that had historical and literary connotations, literary allusions, literary resonances. You can sort of hear that in some of the words of Bialik's poem, and you can certainly hear it in Agnon. One of the great joys of learning Agnon is to learn it and go look up all of the references to the Midrash, to the Bible, to medieval Hebrew poetry and prayer. And English captures it tiny bit, but it's almost like reading like 10%, like 10% of Agnon is here in the English. The other 90%, you have to learn in the Hebrew, and you have to learn in the Hebrew in a library where you can look up all of these references and resonances. Nevertheless, he gives us this beautiful story. So let's take a look at this story together because it's quite remarkable. And I want you to look for the themes of homecoming and at the same time, the longing and the frustration, and at the same time, the sense in which coming back to Israel is not a homecoming, but a revolt against the whole notion of homecoming. Watch. Once upon a time, there was an old man who was very sick. Now, that's an interesting way to start a story, by the way, because here is Agnon, who is on his way to Israel. And like Bialik and like so many of the Zionists, the old man who was very sick represents Jewish culture of Eastern Europe. That's the image, right? The doctor advised him to drink goat's milk. So he went out and bought a goat and brought it to his home. One day, the goat disappeared. She was nowhere to be found. Now, again, the goat who disappears, anybody know that reference? What's that reference? Right? That's the reference to Sel Azazel, the goat of Yom Kippur that's sent out into the wilderness. But this one is into the wilderness. Watch what happens. Finally, she returned by herself. And when she returned, her udder was full of milk that tasted as though it came from the Garden of Eden. It's almost Kabbalistic in its language of a goat that makes its way to the Garden of Eden. This happened time and again. The goat would disappear. They would search for her. They wouldn't find her until she returned by herself with milk that was as sweet as honey. Anyone reference milk and honey? Hear the milk and honey reference, right? One day, the old man said to his son, well, the old man has a son. My son, I would like to know where the goat goes and from where she gets this wonderful milk. Right? I want to know what's the mystery of this goat? This goat has been sent to us to teach us something. What's the mystery of the goat? My son, I would like to know where the goat goes and from where she gets the wonderful milk. So his son said, I have an idea. So he tied a cord to the goat's tail. And when I feel a pull on it, I can catch the end of the cord and follow her on her way. Soon the goat set off. And by the way, chords also have all kinds of resonances. So we can spend some time thinking about each of these images because each of these images is deeply biblical, right? Soon the goat set off and the young man followed her, holding on to the end of the cord. He followed her through the woods until she disappeared into a cave. Cave, interesting image, the cave. He followed her, firmly holding on to the cord. They walked for a long time. Eventually, the goat wagged her tail and bleated, and the cave came to an end. And when he emerged from the cave, the young man saw the beautiful hills. He heard the chirping of birds, fountains of water flowed from the ground, and the breeze was scented with fragrant flowers. Did that sound a little bit like Bialik's talk of the bird, where the bird was going, right? In Bialik's poem, it's the bird who goes there, and here in Agnon's story, it's the goat. The goat nibbled at the lush fruit on the trees and drank the sweet flowing water. There were people around, so the young man asked them, "Where am I?" Remember, God's first question to Adam in the Garden of Eden is, "Ayeka, where are you? Where am I? Where did I come?" And they said, "Well, you're in the land of Israel, very close to the city of Tzfat." Tzfat is the capital of Jewish mysticism. The young man lifted his eyes to heaven. "Thank God, thank you, God, for bringing me to the land of Israel." And he kissed the soil and sat down under a tree and said, "I must bring my father to Eretz Yisrael." But just then he heard a voice proclaiming that Shabbat was about to begin. And remember, Tzfat is where Kabbalat Shabbat was invented. It's where the mystics would go out into the fields and welcome the queen of Shabbat wearing white. All of those customs come from Tzfat. That's where he is. So he wrote a note to his father. "Father, I have come in peace to the land of Israel. Here I sit close to Tzfat, the holy city, and I'm drinking in its sanctity. Don't ask how I got here. Simply hold the cord which is tied to the goat's tail and follow the goat's footsteps. You will eventually find your way here." The young man rolled up the note. That sound familiar? A note rolled up, right? And placed it in the goat's ear and said to himself, "When she arrives at my father's house, my father will pat her on the head and she will flick her ears. The note will fall out. Father will pick it up and read what is written. He will pick up the cord and follow the goat here to the land of Israel." Well, such a beautiful word. Well, because it's never that easy in a Jewish story, right? Well, let me tell you what really happened. The goat returned to the old man, but she didn't flick her ears. And the note did not fall out. The hidden text remained hidden a little bit too long. And when the old man saw that the goat had returned without his son, he clasped his hand to his face and began to cry, my son, where are you?" Okay, remember David crying over his son Shalom, right? "Would that I might have died in your stead." You think of Abraham and the sacrifice. He mourned for his son and refused to be comforted like Jacob. "Surely a wild beast has devoured him." Exactly the words that Jacob said about Joseph, right? "And my son has been torn to pieces." Just what Jacob said. Whenever he saw the goat, he would say, "Woe to the creature who drove him from this world of the living." It grew intolerable for him to look at the goat. So he sent for the butcher to slaughter him. Oh no. And the butcher came and slaughtered the goat. As he did so, the note fell out of the ear. And the old man picked it up and said, "Oh, my son's handwriting." And when he read all the son had written, he clasped his hands to his head and he cried, "Oy vavoy, oy, woe to the one who robs himself of his own good fortune, and woe to the one who pays back good with evil." He mourned over the goat many days and refused to be comforted, saying, "Woe is me, oy vey. There's no longer a shortcut. I could have gone up to the land of Israel with one leap, and now I must suffer out my days in this exile." Okay, let's take a moment. What do you hear in this story? What feelings do you hear? What images do you hear? What's the story about? What is Agnon trying to say about our moment in history, our moment as a Jewish people? What is he trying to say? This is our audience participation part of the game. So all you got to do is unmute and let me know who you are. Douglas, is that you?
Yeah, it's me. Hey,
Hi, how you doing? Hag Sameach, please.
It's there for the taking. You just have to reach out and get it. And the father didn't do that. I mean, the son found it. He made its way. When did he write this story?
Well, I'll tell you what the story is, right? So he's a Zionist.
Yeah.
And he leaves the yeshiva, runs away from home, runs away from the yeshiva, runs away from the shtetl, joins the Zionist movement, leaves his family behind in Europe and makes Aliyah. So tell me how autobiographical this story is.
It is, with all
Right.
the biblical references and allusions. He's telling his father, it's there for the taking. You just have to grasp it.
But the father doesn't
Can't
want.
see it.
The father can't see it because in order to come to Israel, you've got to break away from the community you're living in. You've got to break away from the way of life, but most of all, you have to break away from a way of thinking. And what Agnon is trying to say to his father is, this is holy. What I am doing is holy. And the father says, come back and finish your studies in yeshiva. And the son says, but I am living in the land of Israel. What could be holier than that? And so you see the juxtaposition of homecoming and rebellion at the same time? Homecoming and rebellion, and fathers and sons, and the strange ambivalence of fathers and sons. And how much joy is there for the father to know that his son made it to the land of Israel? But how much pain to know that the way that the shortcut, the way that was waiting for you, that there was a shortcut, but you cut it off. You didn't. You lost the truth. You lost the truth. You lost that way to get there. Redemption could have been yours. And think about Moses, right? Moses, who sends his children across the Jordan to the promised land, but he himself is condemned to die in exile in the wilderness. And how much joy is there to see your children redeemed, but how much pain is there to say, I could have gone with them, but should have gone with them, but for whatever bad fortune is mine. Do you hear the statement there? You hear the longing, the pain, the difficulty. And now think of it for the moment from the other side. Tell me about the son. What's the son thinking? Tell me about the story. What happened to the son?
He started working on a kibbutz and digging up things, and he ended up being a pioneer Zionist and dropping the religion. Though you would see religious philosophers like Yitz Greenberg saying that act itself was religious, right?
Or Rav Kook, which was even in one of the other, the more indigenous mystics, right? But the son who waits and waits at the mouth of the cave for his father to emerge and never comes. And what does the son think? What is the son thinking of his father?
He's been abandoned.
The son blames the father for abandoning him, or blames the father for being too stuck in his ways, blames the father, and is angry at the father, but longs for the father as well. All he wants to do is share with the father, right? I mean, you hear the resonances of both sides. Zionism was a break in family life. All of the Zionists that you know, all the ones whose names you know, those, first of all, they weren't born with those names. Agnon's name wasn't Agnon, it was Chachtik, something like that. I can barely say it. David Ben-Gurion was David Green. They changed their names, they changed their lives, they changed their dress, they changed their religiosity. They broke away from family. You had to break away to go. My parents too, by the way. My mother, I'll be right with you. My mother told me the day I went to Israel for a year when I was in my junior year of college. My mother had a very tough time putting me on that airplane. And she told me years later, she said she finally understood what she did to her mother in 1948 when they went to Israel, when my parents went to Israel. And she never realized what she was doing to her mother until she put me on the plane, and she knew I was coming back in a year. But these were people who broke away from their families in order to pursue a dream that the family had held. Yeah, the writers.
Well, what's funny to me is that here, can you hear me?
Yeah.
What's funny to me is here is the father worrying about his son getting torn to bits. And, and is the son thinking, oh my God, maybe my father died? Is my father okay? Why isn't that happening?
Right. This is before cell phones were invented, and you couldn't just call and say, are you okay? Remember, the father needs the milk in order to stay alive, and he killed the goat, so he doesn't have the milk anymore. I mean, and the slaughtering of a goat is itself an act of sacrifice, and yet sacrifice here doesn't open the way to paradise. It closes the way to paradise. It's It's such a, the story so captures this, right? And it captures the ambivalence on both sides. The ambivalence of the child who breaks away from the family in order to achieve the ideals that the parents had always taught you, but really never wanted you to actually do it, right? And the ideals of the parent who loves his kid and doesn't want to be separated from him, but can feel a pang of joy when he knows that his kid made it to the land of Israel.
But that is what growing up is.
I'm sorry?
That is what growing up is. You have to separate to become autonomous and to become your own person.
And so that's a wonderful image. So think of Zionism as a sort of adolescent identity crisis of the Jewish people. You know, that at a certain point at the beginning of modernity, we stopped and said, who do we want to be now? And it required both a break and a return at the same time. A break and a return. And that's what's amazing. That's what's remarkable. Other comments? Anyone else? So let's take a look now at another piece, which is much more explicit about the break. Chaim Chazaz is a Russian Jewish writer who makes Aliyah in the 1930s. In 1943, he writes a story. It's not much of a story. It's really a speech. It's called the sermon. It's a speech. It's a speech. And he's talking, the story is about a kibbutz meeting. I used to go to these kibbutz meetings. I lived on a kibbutz for a long time. So in the old style kibbutzim, not the ones they have now, but the old style kibbutzim, ideology and culture, tarbut and ideologia, these were important things. And you'd have a weekly kibbutz meeting where the kibbutz would gather, all these socialists, communists, these ideological pioneers would gather to argue and debate about the nature of our project. Just to give you a sense of how it worked, the meetings would start in Hebrew, and then as they got heated, they would move to Yiddish, and late in the evening, they moved to Russian. That's how these meetings would go. So Chaim Chazaz tells a story. This is an excerpt from the story, where a little Jew named Yudke stands up at the kibbutz and says, I want to say something. I want to say something. And he's not a big macher on the kibbutz. Even in the egalitarian world of kibbutzim, there are those who have power and importance and notoriety, and then there's the schleppers, there's the rest of us. And Yudke is one of the schleppers, and he doesn't often speak up, but he decides this moment he has to speak up. And the whole rest of the story is this speech. Listen to this speech. It's just remarkable. He said, this is Yudke. Now, Yudke, by the way, is the Russian or Yiddish sort of diminutive of Yehuda. And Yehuda is the Jew. He's the Jew. Yehuda. I want to state that I'm opposed to Jewish history. Like, really? I'll begin with the fact that we have no history at all. That's a fact. Because we didn't make our own history. The Goyim made it for us. Just as they used to put out our candles on Shabbos and milk our cows and light our ovens on Shabbos. So they made our own history for us to suit themselves. We took it from them as it came. They forced it on us, whether we liked it or not. What's in it? Oppression, defamation, persecution, martyrdom. And again, oppression, defamation, persecution, martyrdom. And again, and again, and again, and again. That's what it is. There's nothing more. After all, it bores you to death. It's just plain dull. Here in Palestine, our children love to read, unless they're not so bright, unless they're stupid. I know this for a fact. I've looked into it. Yet they read historical novels about Goyim, not about Jews. Why is this so? It's no accident. It's simply because Jewish history is dull, uninteresting. It has no glory or action, no heroes or conquerors, no rulers or masters of their fate, just a collection of wounded, hunted, groaning, wailing wretches always begging for mercy. I would simply forbid teaching our children Jewish history. Why the devil teach them about their ancestors' shame? I would say to them, boys, from the day we were driven out of our land, we've been a people without history. Class dismissed, go out and play football. Dude, if you really want to hear the story, you got to hear it in Yossi Dresner's voice, because then you'd understand what this really sounded like. He says, I know that there's history in the way, the heroism, in the way that we stood up to all that oppression and suffering. I take it into account. But it's nothing but the heroism of despair. With no way out, how can anyone be a hero? Whether he wants to or not, he must be. There's no credit or honor in that. In the second place, that heroism, after all, amounts to great weakness, worse than weakness, a special kind of talent, a special talent for corruption and decay. That's how it is. That type of hero sooner or later begins to pride himself on his heroism, and he brags about it. See what great torments I withstand. See what untold shame and humiliation I suffer. Who can compare with me? See, we didn't merely suffer torments. It's more than that. We love these torments. We love torments for their own sake. We want to be tortured. We're eager for it. To my mind, Zionism, and if I'm right, he says Zionism and Judaism are not the same. Two quite different things from each other, and maybe even two directly opposite each other. At any rate, far from the same. When a man can no longer be a Jew, he becomes a Zionist. Zionism begins with the wreckage of Judaism. From that point, when the strength of the people fails, that's a fact. Nobody's ever begun to understand Zionism. It's far deeper, far more pregnant with vast and fateful consequences than appears on the surface or people say. Listen to what Chazaz is telling us. It's quite remarkable. He's saying that Zionism and Judaism are the opposite, because Zionism begins when you get sick of being the victim. And Judaism, he says, is the history of Jewish victimhood. And I don't want to teach that victimhood to our children. Now, what's interesting about this is he's reflecting an attitude. It's the attitude of the second Aliyah. It's the attitude of the forefathers of Israel. This is the attitude that taught children in Israeli schools Bible because they wanted heroes. This is the attitude that resurrected Hanukkah as a major holiday because they wanted Judah Maccabee. This is the attitude that gave them no Talmud, no medieval Jewish history, because they felt this was all the history of victimhood. And most significantly, this was the attitude that up until just 20 or 30 years ago rejected the Holocaust as a significant event in our history. The Zionists didn't want to see the Holocaust or the survivors of the Holocaust as anything heroic. They saw it as a tragedy, not a tragedy because of what happened to us, but a tragedy because we sucked it up and accepted it. The Holocaust, for this attitude about history, the Holocaust was the ultimate sort of epitome of Jewish victimhood: weakness, passivity, impotence, failure to stand up for ourselves. This is the attitude. So this idea of which now it changed, and I can describe to you in visible terms the change. In 1960, when they captured Eichmann and brought him to Jerusalem, that's when they decided to build a museum to the Holocaust, and that's when Yad Vashem was created. And the first Yad Vashem, the first Israeli museum of the Holocaust, was a long, narrow building. And you walked in and you walked through this long, narrow hall with two long walls on each side. On one side was the story of the destruction of European Jewry, sort of a diorama and timeline with images and pictures of the destruction of European Jewry. And on the other side was the story of the ghetto fighters, the heroism, those who revolted in the concentration camps, and those who revolted in the ghettos, and those who fought back, and the partisans who fought against the Nazis. It was Yom HaShoah Ugvura, the day of destruction, remembering the destruction and celebrating their heroism. That was the answer. And then slowly over the years in Israel, an attitude changed. That's what this represents. The Jewish history was a history of victimhood, and there was nothing there to celebrate. And that Zionism is a rejection of Jewish history. Well, Zionism says we refuse to be a victim any longer. We refuse to be passive. We refuse to be impotent. We refuse to accept that upon ourselves. It changed. And if you go to Israel now, it's changed. The new Yad Vashem is a very, very different museum. And what happened is that over the years that Israel has suffered, and like they're suffering today, all of the bombardments and all of the terrorism and all of this endless war that Israel, they began to understand that perseverance is a form of heroism. And that the hero wasn't just the young partisan who picked up a rifle and decided to fight back against the Nazis. Heroism was also the ghetto mother who gave all of her rations to her children. Heroism was the rabbi who continued to teach a kid for his bar mitzvah in the Warsaw ghetto. Heroism was the perseverance of the people not to give up hope and not to give up faith and not to give up their ideals in the face of such horrific suffering. And so the story you'll see now in Israel is very different than the story you would have seen 25 or 30 years ago. But what Chaim Hazaz in this poem is reflecting on is that idea that Judaism and Zionism are not this, that Zionism is a break, not a homecoming, but a brand new beginning of a completely different character, that the Zionist is a different character than the Jew. And that's a little hard for us to understand, to hear, but that's exactly what he's trying to say. That's exactly what he's trying to point to, okay? Douglas, you're making a funny face, so go ahead and ask your question. You have to unmute so I can hear you. If you just unmute, I can.
I'm on.
There you go.
Okay. When he does that, he is rejecting all of biblical Judaism, which says when bad stuff happens to us, it's our fault. When the temple was destroyed, it's our fault. They're rejecting all theology up till that moment.
Oh yeah.
You know.
He's rejecting theology in general. What he's rejecting is the embracing of victimhood as somehow, deserved or just. He's rejecting the idea that we accepted victimhood, that we lived with it, that we internalized it. That's what he's rejecting. He wants Jews to be strong, to be resolute, and to fight back. That wonderful line where he says, our kids read historical novels, but not about Jews, because there are no historical novels about Jews, because all of Judaism is about victims. And who the hell wants to read about victimhood? I want to read about knights in shining armor. I want to read about heroes who fight back. I want to hear about, right? I mean, you understand what he's trying to say. A new Jew who is strong, a new Jew who is resolute, a new Jew is Judah Maccabee. It was the Zionists who made Judah Maccabee, right? A badass Jew, right? Rabbi Akiva was not a badass Jew. Maybe Bar Kokhba was, but not Rabbi, But Judah Maccabee, you don't mess with Judah Maccabee, right? That's the idea. That's exactly right. It's a change in attitude. But here you see, on the one hand, now put the two stories together, right? So you have Agnon's longing for the land, a place of redemption, the homecoming. And then you have Hazaz who says, no, coming home isn't coming home. Coming home is coming to a brand new place. This is not coming home. This is going to a brand new place. Or if I'm coming home as a very different character than the one I left. Revolution, the idea of a revolution, Zionism is a revolution in the attitude of the Jewish people, Okay?
Does that leave us still in Galut in their minds?
Well, it depends. So for Chaim Hazaz, Galut is your attitude toward yourself. Do you see yourself as being a victim, and do you worship that? That's the question. It's a very interesting question. And then what's the perversion of this? I mean, the perversion of this is the Zohan. It's an aggressive, arrogant Israeli who has no patience for anybody. I mean, that's the sort of caricature of that kind of tough pushback Israeli, right? All right, let's take a look at some more sources. Unless anyone has other questions. Other questions? Okay, stump the panel here. Here we go. So now we go. That was 1943. Let's take a look at Yehuda Amichai. So, of course, Yehuda Amichai comes from Germany as a 13-year-old, moves into Jerusalem, lives in Jerusalem, and writes beautiful poetry. And the poetry that he writes is so sweet. It's sweet. It's not hard to understand. It's not complicated. This is not T.S. Eliot. But it's so reflective of the paradoxes of who we are. So listen to Amichai's vision of what we're talking about. The homecoming, which is also a revolution, a rejection of things. The air over Jerusalem is saturated with prayers and dreams, sort of air pollution. The air pollution over Yerushalayim is because there's so many prayers and dreams in the air, like the air over industrial cities. It's hard to breathe. And from time to time, a new shipment of history arrives. It's a great line. And the houses and towers are its packing materials. Later, these are discarded and piled up in dumps. And sometimes candles arrive instead of people. Then it's quiet. Candles are what we use to remember loved ones, right? And sometimes people come instead of candles. And then there's noise. And sometimes they're memories of people gone by, and sometimes the people themselves show up as refugees. And in the enclosed gardens, heavy with jasmine, foreign consulates, like wicked brides that have been rejected, lie in wait for their moment. All of these, so we live in Jerusalem, but the consulates of these foreign countries are like, they're like rejected people, because it's like a little bit of gullus right here in the middle of the holy city, right? They don't quite belong there. Listen to the next image. Jerusalem is a seesaw. Sometimes I dip down into past generations, and sometimes I rise skyward and then yell like a child yelling, his legs swinging up. I want to get off, Dad. I want to get off. Dad, help me off. And that's how all holy men ascend to heaven, like children shouting, Father, I want to stay up here. Father, don't let me down. Don't get me down. Our Father, our King, Avinu Malkeinu. Leave us up here. Our Father, our King. Now that's a beautiful image of paradox. The beautiful image of paradox of Jerusalem, of Israel, is a seesaw. Sometimes we swing downward toward all the generations that have come before us, downward toward our roots, downward toward our history, downward toward all the memories that are accumulated in the soil of Jerusalem. And sometimes we're flung upwards into a new world. And like little kids, we're frightened because we don't know how we're going to get down. We don't know if we're going to get down. Being flung upwards into this new world is completely foreign to us. But it's exhilarating and it's remarkable. And like a child's glee, a child's joy, we scream with delight, Avinu Malkeinu. Let us just stay up here. Let us just stay with this. And you go down to the memories and up to the dreams, and down to the memories and up to the dreams. And that is a beautiful image. That is just a beautiful image of what Zionism is, a connection to the old and the possibilities of the new, and somehow a reconciliation between the two, a connection between the two. Right? That's his beautiful one. Now the next several we're going to see are more ironic, more and more ironic about the same basic attitude. Yonatan Geffen is one of the really wonderful poets of Israel, and he writes a lot of children's poetry, children's stories. And this is a beautiful one. You can see that he's born in 1947. He's born right at the edge of the state, right? And you know, he grows up in Israel with parents who had come during the 20s. Okay? And his parents are going to raise him, like my parents raised me, on all the stories of the great pioneers who came before you. And what happens when you're raised in an atmosphere thick with nostalgia for times that aren't the same anymore, for heroes that aren't around anymore, with stories about what is? Part of it is it's glory to have that. But part of it is it can be awfully frustrating, you know? So he writes this really ironic poem. It's a song called Maybe It's Over. They say it was happy here before I was born. It was a great place before. It used to be a great place. Everything was simply wonderful until I arrived. A Hebrew guard, that's the Hebrew guards were the pioneers of the Galil who were protecting the settlements from the Arab marauders in the 20s, on a white horse, it should be a white horse, in the black of night. Trumpeldor, the hero on the shores of the Kinneret. Trumpeldor was this great patriot who died defending the kibbutzim of the north Little Tel Aviv, red sands, one Bialik, two sycamore trees, beautiful people full of dreams. We came to Israel to build and rebuild. Anu banu arza livnotu lehibanot ba. That was the great Zionist song. Because this land is ours, ours, ours. Here where you see grass, there were just mosquitoes and swamps. They say there was once a wonderful dream, but when I came to look, I found nothing. Maybe it's over. Maybe the dream is over. Maybe the dream is over. Having built the land, the nostalgia of what was, of the process of building it, is so thick that the kids who inherited it said, maybe it's not for us. They say it was happy here before I was born. Everything was wonderful till I arrived. The Palmach, that was the great fighting force. Finjan, the campfire where you made black coffee in starlight. The British, the underground, a satchel full of tall tales, mustache and forelock, keffiyeh around the throat. Yaron Zahavi, he was a great hero. Alterman, great poet. Tamar, don't ask. Pretty girls in short pants. They had reason to get up each morning because this land is ours, ours, ours. Before Israel became suburban, before there were highways and roads, it was all mud. That was the story we all heard. And this idea that before you were born, oh, was it wonderful. It was horrible and it was wonderful. We had idealism. We had pioneer spirit. And now what do we have? Freeways. And he says, how do I attach myself to that dream? So the paradox moves forward a generation. Not only was the pioneer generation a break, but now the question is, how does the suburban generation, how does the baby boom, as it were, generation, how do they find their place in this? Where is their place in the Israeli story? That's the question that he wants to know. And he says, maybe it was so good before I was born. And now, do I have a place here? Do I really have a place? We were pioneers, but what does the next generation inherit from the generation of the pioneers? What do the builders give to their children? That's the great question. Now, let's skip the next one for a moment because I want to save that for the end. Ehud Manor is one of the great songwriters of Israel. And you'll notice the date. This is 1982. What happened in 1982? In 1982, Menachem Begin leads Israel in an invasion of Lebanon. And this is a very controversial and in many ways a pivotal moment in Israeli history, because this is the first time we fought a war that wasn't a direct defensive war, right? 1967, 1948 to fight the war to bring the country to be, right? 56 is a little strange, but 67, we were being attacked. 73, we're being attacked. In 82, he goes out to clean out the PLO from southern Lebanon and decides, against American advice, to go into Beirut. And that's where you have Sabra and Shatila. And that's the beginning of a change, a beginning of the change of the way Israel is seen by the world, and a beginning of a change in the way Israel sees itself. Because that's the first time Israel is fighting a war as a powerful, against an enemy that wasn't as powerful as Israel was. It's the first time David becomes Goliath. And there's a lot of criticism, and there's a lot of second guessing, and there's a lot of wondering whether it was the right thing to do. And there's a torturous process within Israel to try to figure out, what does this mean for us? How does this change us as Israelis? And here, listen to the song. Again, this is not philosophy or journalism, it's a song. It's popular music. And people are criticizing the country. And this is when, by the way, this is when people start leaving. This is when people start leaving to come to America, right? And he writes, I have no other homeland, even when the ground is burning. Just one word ever turning, in my mind into my soul. Though racked with pain, I murmur again, this is my home. This is my home. I must speak, for my homeland seems to be changing. I can't be silent, I must remind it. Sing, although my heart is breaking, until I see that it's waking. I have no other homeland. I'll sing, though my heart is breaking, until I see that it is waking. You can criticize, You can vote. You can vote out the government. You can protest. But don't ever forget that this is my homeland. This is where I belong. This is where I live. This is where I have roots. And the paradox of what happens when the country I so love, when the country I have invested so much of myself and my family, so much blood and so much tears, does things that I find difficult. How do I live with that? How do I make sense of that? And Manor says, you can protest and sing and try to wake up the country, but don't ever forget it's still home. It's still the homeland. And you feel the paradox there as well. You feel the strength of the paradox there as well. It belongs to me, although sometimes it's not an easy place to live. It belongs to me, and sometimes it feels kind of strange to me. It belongs to me, and I feel like I have to say something. I have to push out. He represents a whole generation of Israeli protest music. There's a huge generation of Israeli protest music. And that's just one piece of it. And in all of it, you get this idea. Because you see, you don't protest something you don't care about. If there wasn't a deep sense of connection to the land, a deep sense of connection to the people of Israel, a deep sense of connection to the culture, then you wouldn't have anything, you wouldn't bother protesting. You would simply leave, or you would simply back away from it. But he represents that deep sense of homeland. This is my place. This is where I belong, and it's worth fighting for. It's worth protesting because it's worth fighting for. All right, any other comments about this? And let's do two more songs, because these two are more happy. These two are songs that are a little more hopeful than Manor's song. And both of them are kind of sweet. And they have, but you'll see the bittersweetness of both of them, right? So David Broza, famous Israeli folk singer, he's around all the time. This is called Yeh Tov. Now that phrase, by the way, Yeh Tov, is one of the phrases you'll hear in Israel more than any other phrase. It means it'll be all right. Don't worry about it. It'll be okay. Right? You're in a cab and you ask the cab driver, so what's going to be with the Palestinians? He says, who knows? Yeh Tov, something will come of it. That is, a people that has suffered and sacrificed so much still has some sort of strange optimism. He writes this, by the way, and I left out a little bit of the poem, but he writes this in 1977. So 1977, I was in Israel in 1977. The Yom Kippur War is still in the air. The bardak, the mistake, the fact that Israel got snuck up on. And yet at the same time, and all the terrorism that followed. And then this is the year that Sadat comes to Israel. Sadat comes to Israel and changes the whole way of thinking about where we are in the world. And he writes this song. It's a very sweet song. Yeh Tov, Yeh Tovaz. It's going to be okay. And he says, I look out the window, it makes me very sad. Spring has left, and who knows when it will return. The clown has become king, and the prophet has become a clown. And I have forgotten the way, but I'm still here. And all will be good. Yeh Tov, it'll be okay. All will be good. Though sometimes I break down. But tonight, this night, I'll stay here with you. And who is with you? Well, he's singing a love song to a lover, but he's also singing to the land. And he's also singing to his people. And he's also singing to the Jewish people. Children wear wings and fly off to the army, and after 2 years, they return without an answer. People live under stress, looking for a reason to breathe. And between hatred and murder, they talk about peace. Yeh Tov, it'll be okay. It'll be good. And yes, up there in the sky, clouds are learning how to fly, and I look up and I see a hijacked airplane. A government of generals divide the land to what's theirs and ours, and we do not. When will we see the end? We will yet learn to live together. Between the groves of olive trees, children will live without fear. Without borders, without bomb shelters, on graves, grass will grow. For peace and love, 100 years war, but we have not lost hope. Od lo avda tikvatenu. Yetov. It will yet be good. It will yet be good. This is a very popular song. I mean, a very popular song. This is one of these songs that every Israeli knows by heart. Because it represents an attitude of, yes, it's bad and it keeps getting worse, but yeah, Tov, we'll figure it out. We figured everything else out. We'll figure this one out. And here you hear a paradox as well. It's not the same paradox we heard before. It's a paradox of, I look at a world that's impossible to live in, but I refuse to give up hope. I refuse to give up hope. I refuse to let go of my hope. And I just want you to remember who is David Broza. Just as an analogy, think about who the great singers of the 60s were to those of us who grew up in the 60s, to Bob Dylan and Peter, Paul and Mary, and then, and then all the other great singers of the 60s and 70s. And even now, those who sang of cultural movements, and that's who David Broza is. And he sings Yeh Tov. He's talking about the real deep hope that is stitched into the people of Israel. Yes, writers. You have to unmute so I can hear you, please. There you go.
You muted?
Yeah, thank you.
It's funny because David is really close friends with my stepsister. And
oh my gosh.
Yeah, really good friends. And so at her husband's 40th birthday, 60th birthday, he came and he sang to all of us and he talked about his history. He talked about his love of Israel. And he's so well known there. I mean, like you say David Broza and everybody knows who he is, as you said. But what's fascinating about him is that his lyrics are amazing and they're beautiful, but his guitar playing actually sings. The actual words. So it's like, it's a double. You're not just getting the lyrics, you're getting the feeling, you're like there in Israel, seeing this and becoming part of it through his guitar.
Highly emotional.
It is, I can't even describe it because the guitar actually sings more than he is.
Yeah, except I have to tell you, he's a brilliant musician. He's a wonderful performer. And I met him as well, and he's a lovely, lovely man. But if you say his name to a young Israeli, they will roll their eyes at you. No, they know who he is, but they will roll their eyes the way that my kids roll their eyys when I tell them how much I used to like Bob Dylan.
That's
right?
exactly the comparison. He's our Bob Dylan.
Right. Yeah, it works for the generation, his generation, for the generation of the 60s and the 70s, and we love him. But the younger kids who are much more extreme in their, on the one hand, in their cynicism and their protest and their detachment from the situation, from the history and the memories, and at the same time, some of them are much more ferociously nationalistic, depends on which side of the political divide you are. And they all look at him as an old fart, as an old fogey, right? As a sentimental old fogey, right? Except that, that attitude, the reason I love this song is because the attitude is still very real. I mean, even today, if you listen to Israeli news right now, like, how is this going to end? I don't know. We'll work it out. This is going to, yeah, Tov. There is something about that attitude that carries Israelis from day to day. Mm-hmm. I mean, otherwise, there's no reason the country should have gone on living, because there's every historical reason for a country to fail. Israel had this crappy place with no resources, hundreds and thousands, millions of refugees who show up without any acculturation, without the language, right? Arab armies on every side, terrorism. There's every reason in the world that this country should have failed. And yet for some reason, these people get up in the morning and they go on doing stuff, the bus driver, the plumber, if you can get them to show up, the professor, the politician, we'll figure it out. I mean, that attitude is still there. That attitude is still there. And that's the paradox. That's the current paradox. That's the contemporary reflection of homecoming and exile, which exists in the same place. Homecoming and revolt, or homecoming and exile in the same place, right? You're muted, so I can't hear you, but I'm sure that you said was important. Say it again.
I
There.
was just going to say that. Do you have the song in Hebrew? Because it was in Hebrew.
Yeah, and I just gave you the English lyrics because if you hear the song in Hebrew, you don't know Hebrew. It's hard. Yeah, tov, yeah, tov. I can play it for you. Okay. All right, let's do one. Could do one more? You guys ready up for one more song? I brought
the album. You can order the albums.
You can order the albums, right? Okay, let's take one more time. All right, so I brought one more hopeful song because I didn't want to leave with all the news and it's just too hard to. So this is 1983. Okay, so 1983. So remember Echon Manor's song about I'm going to sing until people wake up and listen to me. And now you get a different voice. This is Ofra Chaza, and this is the song that won the European Eurovision, and it's called Chai. Again, this is another song that every Israeli kid knows by heart, but they'll roll their eyes if you play it for them. So it's 1883. So it's Odani Chai. I'm still alive. So listen, my brothers, I'm still alive. So in 1982, of course, Begin invades, and there's this tremendous crisis of conscience in the country after Sabra and Shatila, in which we are implicated. Now, we didn't do it, of course, but we're complicit. We're implicated in an atrocity. And 1983, and there's a sense that Israeli power has begun to erode Israeli conscience, and there's a crisis of conscience in the country. There's one going on now. I mean, there's a crisis of conscience going on in the country now, and right now they're all in bomb shelters, so nobody's up for debates. But the question of what is the morality of Israeli power, and is there a chance for peace in this world, and is there a chance for peace in this region? Is there a chance for a better life for our children, or are we going to have another generation of kids going into the military? And she writes a very hopeful song. Od Anichai, listen, my brothers, I'm still alive, and my two eyes are still raised to the light. Many are the thorns, but also the flowers. And ahead of me are years too numerous to count. I ask, I pray, it's good. And it's good that hope was not yet lost. A psalm passes from generation to generation like a spring from long ago and on to eternity. I ask and I pray, it is good that hope was not yet lost. Chai, chai, chai. Yes, I'm still alive. Live, live, live. This is the song which grandfather sang yesterday to father, and I sing today. Now, that's a very powerful lyric if you think about that. I'm doing something which my ancestors did. I'm passing forward to my children a love of this land, a love of this people, and a love of a hope for peace. And today I sing, I'm still alive. The people of Israel live. Od Am Yisrael Chai. This is the song which grandfather sang yesterday to father, and I still sing. So in contrast to the protest movement that came in 82, she shows up at the Eurovision and says, I'm still alive, singing the ancient song of my people, because I haven't given up hope. My days and nights are full of life, and my sky, the pillar of fire, still rises. Pillar of fire in the Exodus story, right? I will sing endlessly. I'll spread out my hands to friends across the sea. Now, is that sea from the ocean to the world, or is that sea the Red Sea? And I ask and I pray, it's good that hope was not yet lost. What you have in these songs, what's so wonderful, is this beautiful, ironic recognition that we have achieved the dream, and yet we haven't achieved all of it. And there's still so much suffering, so much difficulty, so much pain that goes along with the dream, and yet the dream still sustains us. We've made it home. We've broken away from home. We've made it home, but home isn't what home was supposed to be. And yet we're holding on because we still have this dream that home could yet be what home is supposed to be. And let's hope that we still feel that way. Any last comments or thoughts? Any comments or thoughts from anyone? Okay, well, thank you for, Pam, you got one more thought? Yeah.
This is just really meaningful and really beautiful, especially right now. And I needed this, so thank you.
Well, thank you. I needed it too. So I appreciate the opportunity to revisit some of these beautiful lyrics and these old songs. Yeah, Ronnie, go ahead.
This has nothing to do with learning, but it's very funny. You can say to Alexa, I'm worried she'll do it now if she hears me, play Israeli music.
Yeah, and you'll get this stuff, yeah.
You get, but everything sounds Arabic. Nothing sounds like it has a familiar nigun or anything familiar with which we grew up. It is so different. It is
Contemporary Israeli music has resurrected Mizrahi music. Mizrahi music is the music of the Arab community, the Jewish Arab communities. And they have created a whole new genre of Mizrahi music and piyut. It's actually quite beautiful if you can get into it.
But what are
and that really is.
Yeah, what are the lyrics of this generation? What is it really? Because
Some of it's religious stuff that's being redone, new piyut, new religious poetry, and some of it is reflecting on the condition. Right, you're now in what, a fourth generation of Israelis, right? Since '48, so you're 3-4 generations of Israelis reflecting on the experiences of living in this country, a country which is so deeply paradoxical. Startup nation, very wealthy, lots of power, and at the same time powerless to do certain things to bring peace to its people. I mean, today they're in shelters. I mean, so you'll hear all of those themes in the music. All of those themes in the music.
You know, you probably know this because you knew Malka so well, but you know, she appreciated rap because it's the poetry of a culture.
Yeah, well, and there's Israeli versions of rap. Rap is actually easier in Hebrew than in English because the verbs, the songs, the words all rhyme. You know, if they have feminine endings, they all rhyme. So it's easier. It's easier to do rapping in Hebrew. Mel Aronoff, hi, welcome. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I was just thinking that in the last decade or so, there's been a massive infusion of reference to tefillot, to the everything in the Torah, the Tanakh. There's been a shift from what used to be not cool within Israel to make all those religious references. Yeah. It seems that the popular music is infused with that now, and I just wanted to get your reaction to that observation.
Yeah, well, of course, the scholar of this stuff, I'm not. I'm just a dilettante here, but the scholar of this stuff is my friend Yossi Klein Halevi. Yossi, who is a wonderful political journalist. Contemporary Israeli rock music is his hobby. So every year when I go to Hartman or when I study with the Hartman, he does a workshop on contemporary Jewish music. And every time I have a chance to speak with him, I tell him, give me 5 records I have to go buy or 5 recordings I have to buy. And he sends me wonderful lists. So he pointed this out. You're exactly right. It's actually stuff that was once rejected in 2 ways. Number one, you remember that the Mizrahi community, Jews from Arab lands, from Iraq and from Persia and from Yemen and from Morocco and from Tunisia and Libya, the Mizrahi community was always put down in favor of European communities. It was considered to be a low-class culture, and it was European Jewish culture that was exalted. Well, that's completely reversed itself. I mean, I hate to use this analogy, and I don't mean this in any way to be racist, and if it is, I apologize, but it's the same way that white Jewish kids love ghetto rap, that they've embraced rap music, which is the music of Compton and inner city Chicago and Detroit, and African-American cultural memes have become the music that white Jewish kids in suburbia love so much. In the same way, Mizrahi music has moved to the forefront of Israeli music. And as you said so beautifully, the religious life that was always thought as somewhat off to the side has become core music. You turn on the radio, AM radio, or FM, the equivalent of KLOS, and you're listening to piyut, you're listening to Mizrahi Orthodox Jewish music. You're listening to medieval poetry put to modern rap kinds of beats. It's just remarkable stuff. And then people are writing new stuff, new piyutim. So it's just in terms of Jewish culture, it is a huge revolution. And what's so beautiful about it, and I love this, I thank you for raising it, is that it's ours. It's not copying American folk music. Like Arik Einstein was the first great Israeli sort of rocker, but his stuff was all like very derivative of American rock music. He was trying to be a little Bob Dylan and a little Pete Seeger and a little Mick Jagger, and But the Mizrahi stuff is so indigenous to Israeli culture. It's so deeply Israeli. It's hard to understand if you're an American because the Hebrew is very complicated. In the same way that listening to American rap is hard if you don't know English real well. But it's deeply indigenous, and it's kind of beautiful that now we're creating our own stuff. We're finally creating our own music. Ahad Ha'am, the great grandfather of Israeli culture, would have been very proud. Very, very proud. So thank you. Hi, Judy.
I keep up with it with this lady.
Well, she's a great mistress of Jewish music. So it's good to see you guys. Thanks for joining us. Okay. Anyone else? Someone else had a hand up a moment ago. I have all these wonderful Jewish musicians on here. This is wonderful. All right. So here's what we're going to do. Thank you for being with us. It's now 9:42, 9:43. We're once again going to take a 5-minute break. And at 9:48, we're going to come back, and Rabbi Farkas and I are going to do a little more teaching for you. And we're going to enjoy, we're going to talk about what it means to lose a home and what you remember when you do. So we'll talk about that part at the beginning of Jewish Galut. So everybody take a 5-minute break and come on back and learn with us, and we'll just do one more session, and then we'll call it a night. Okay? Okay.
Hello, Rabbi.
Hello, Rabbi. How are you?
Good, Yashar Koach. Nice teaching.
Well, it's been an interesting day. Interesting day. Okay. All right, as we're getting ready to start again, just a reminder to everyone that tonight we're going to teach another hour or so, and then we can fulfill our obligations to stay up all night learning. Tomorrow morning, we're going to have prayers at 10 o'clock in the morning. Those who are pre-registered can meet us at the temple. We'll be in person. If you haven't pre-registered, I think you probably still can. And if you're not, you can join us online at 10 o'clock. The service will be streamed. Tomorrow evening.
Pre-register now, but if there's a person, just put it in the chat and I'll be there in the morning. You can
All
let
right,
me
Voice
know.
of God says all you got to do is put your name in the chat and Alana will make sure you get in. Tomorrow night, we'll be davening, not in person. Tomorrow night, we'll be doing it just on Zoom because the synagogue will be closed for the holiday. On Tuesday morning, we're not going to have a service in person. We will do it 8:30 in the morning on Zoom and on Facebook and YouTube. The reason is because our kids will be in. They're going to be doing Shavuot from school. And because we have all the children in the building, we're not allowed to have large groups of adults. So please join us online. Service begins at 8:30. Yisker will be approximately 9:30, quarter to 10. If you would like to say Yisker in person and you don't want to do it by Zoom, it works either way, by the way. But if you'd like to do it by in person, Yossi will be leading Mincha Mariv, the afternoon service and evening service from VBS live in person at 6 o'clock on Tuesday evening. And he'll begin Mincha with Yisker. So you can do Yisker in the morning with Rabbi Farkas and Cantor Baron, or Yisker in the evening with Yossi. Both times will be online, plus evening will be in person. And then the holiday will conclude and we will begin the rest of the week. So I hope it's a really sweet yontif for you. I hope you got some good milchiks to celebrate with. So we'd like to finish tonight with a story that's not a happy story. Actually has a kind of sad ending, but it's a remarkable text. And given all of the events that we're hearing about in the world, we thought this would be an interesting text to finish with and to learn something from. So in the year 70, well, let me go back a second. In the year 67, the Jews of Jerusalem revolted against the Roman Empire. The Romans took this very seriously. They took it very seriously for a simple reason. Judea was a very powerful and very wealthy and very plum province of the Roman Empire. And it had been, the Romans had done a really bad job of governing it because it was such a wealthy province that instead of sending someone who was an adept governor, they kept sending friends of the emperor, people who could bribe the emperor to get the job as the governor of Judea. And one after the other, those governors just kept inciting the populace. So finally, in 67, the populace of Jerusalem rises up against the Romans. Now, the reason this caught the eye of the Romans, because Judea wasn't just any other place. Judea was a very significant place. For one thing, the Romans were deathly afraid of the Persian Empire, which is just to the east. And Judea was the outpost that protected that end of the empire, the eastern end of the empire. If Judea would have fallen, then the Persians could have overrun the eastern end of the empire. That's the first problem. The second problem was that the Roman Empire by 70 was highly overextended, that it was running an empire from as far west as Britain and Spain and as far east as, well, Judea and beyond, into Jordan and into Syria. And they just didn't have the manpower. They just didn't have the authority to maintain those borders. And so it was a pretty tenuous situation governing a place like Judea. And third, because the Jewish people were very powerful. There was a very powerful Jewish community in Rome and a very powerful Jewish community in Alexandria. And when the revolt began in 67, all of those communities rose up against the Romans. We think of the Roman Empire as this invincible power because we've seen all these movies, Gladiator, things like that. But the fact is that the Roman Empire was in deep trouble by the year 70. And when the Jews rose up against it, it was a deeply troubling thing that the Romans had to put this down and make an example of it. So they took their most talented general, a man named Vespasian, who's a Spanish bullfighter, and they put him on a boat with the 10th Legion, their best troops, and they landed him in Phoenicia. And the Roman armies then marched down the coast to Jaffa, turned left and went up into the hills and besieged the city of Jerusalem. And the battles began. And the city of Jerusalem fell in the year 70. Now, generation later, the rabbis reflected on this and wondered what happened. And it was a serious question. What happened? Partly was, what's the strategic mistakes that the Jewish people made? Because they really could have maybe even sued for some sort of peace from the Romans. But more deeply than that, what could we learn from this? What could we learn from this experience? Now, the reason why this is such a painful story to read and such an important story to read is this is the story of the last time Jews had sovereignty. This is 70, in the year 70 was the last time Jews had a country of their own. This is how we lost it and went into exile for 1800 years. So the rabbis are going to ask, the rabbis of the Talmud are going to ask the question, what did we learn from this experience? First, they're going to tell the story of how we lost Jerusalem, and then they're going to reflect on all of the reasons. And that's what we'd like to take a look at tonight, see what we can learn at. Rabbi, you want to add anything? Okay, here's the text. Go ahead.
Oh, the only thing I want to add as you're telling that story and setting it up is just going back to what Rabbi Feinstein and I were teaching earlier about what does it take to build a home, how much energy it requires, how much slack and how much love and kindness that is it required to create Shalom bayit. And being at home also means being comfortable in your skin, who you are inside and out. And if you take those ideas and then think about how they're played out in these contexts of these stories, you'll see why we lost our home, not just from a military invasion, but from what happened from the inside. So I just wanted to set that up, and I'll give it back to you, Ed.
So, Rabbi, the section is from the Talmud in Gittin. That's irrelevant why it's there, but here's the section. I broke it up into a script because I live in Hollywood, right? So it's a sermon by Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan is a rabbi who lives around the year 200 CE. That is, he lives 150 years after 120 years after the destruction. Okay, he's looking back. He's looking backwards from 100 years later. What happened to us? How did we end up here? How did we end up in exile? How did we end up homeless? How did we end up without sovereignty? And what he does is what's typical in a rabbinic sermon is he's going to choose a verse from somewhere in the Bible and use that verse as sort of basis of his teaching. And the verse is from the book of Proverbs. Happy is the man who fears always, but he that hardens his heart shall fall into mischief. That's an interesting verse. A man who is living with yira, with reverence, and doesn't harden his heart, that is, doesn't become arrogant, but understands that he's living in the world and he's responsible for the world he lives in. And then Rabbi Yochanan throws in a bizarre story. It was because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, Jerusalem was destroyed. So here's the story. We have two guys, and they have a funny name. And the names sound familiar. They sound similar. One guy is named Kamsa, and the other guy is named Bar Kamsa. Now, you've never heard of these guys. Either is anybody else. That's the point. He's saying Jerusalem was not destroyed because of the leaders. Well, you'll see in a moment. Jerusalem was destroyed. The events began on a normal Tuesday, like a normal day among simple people. How did we lose holiness in the world? How was God exiled from the world? Because of two crazy men named Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, right? Here's what happened. A certain man had a friend named Kamsa and an enemy named Bar Kamsa. So we don't even know who the man is. We just know that this man had a friend named Kamsa, who was his friend, and an enemy who had a very similar name. He had a friend named John and another friend named Johnson. John Johnson, right? He, that is the host, we'll call him the host, once made a party. His kid had a bar mitzvah. And he said to the servant, go bring my friend Kamsa. So the servant went, it's hard to get good help in Jerusalem, and brought the other guy. He brought Bar Kamsa. Instead of bringing John, he brought Johnson, who was his enemy. When the host found Bar Kamsa at the party, he was incensed. Imagine you're giving your kids bar mitzvah party, and there's a guy who you can't stand. You just hate this guy. And he walks up to him and he says, you son of a gun, you're the one who spreads evil about me. What are you doing here? Get out. Now, just for a moment, if Bar Kamsa was his enemy, why would he accept an invitation to the guy's bar mitzvah party? Well, think about this for a second. Why would an enemy invite you to his kid's bar mitzvah? Well, maybe he thought he wanted to reconcile. Maybe he thought bygones were bygones. Maybe he thought on the day of his simcha, his daughter's wedding, his grandson's bris, the guy's going to let go of his animosity. He's going to allow me to say, I'm sorry. And he goes to the party with perfectly good intentions to celebrate this person's good fortune, even though it's a person who's been an enemy, a person that he's had animosity with. And the host shows up, and in front of all the other guests, he screams at him, what are you doing here? Get out of my house. Get out of my house. So this Bar Kamsa takes him aside, and he says, look, I'm here. I'm here. Don't humiliate me. Don't humiliate me. I will pay for whatever I eat and drink. I'll pay for the meal. Just don't humiliate me in front of the community. And the host says quite out loud, get out, you bastard, right? And Bar Kamsa says to him, then tell you what, I'll pay for half the party. I'll pay for half the party. Just don't humiliate me. No, get out, says the other one. He says, okay, I'll pay for the whole party. I'll pay for your daughter's wedding. Just don't humiliate me in front of the community. And the host still refused, took him by the hand and cast him out. Said Bar Kamsa to himself, the rabbis were sitting there and did not stop him. This shows they agreed with him. I will go and inform against them to the Roman government. What a weird story. I mean, you're talking about the destruction of the holiest place in all the world for the Jewish people. You're talking about the temple that Solomon built. You're talking about the place where God enters the world. You're talking about the one place in the world where heaven and earth kiss. And it's destroyed because of a guy's dinner party? So what are the rabbis trying to say? What's rule number one? What are we learning from this? So rule number one, it seems to me, and we can debate this, is it has to do with the quality of relationships in a community. That the holiness of the city means nothing if the people of the city can't live together. If a human being can walk into a community gathering and be humiliated in front of the community, if the texture of life, the fabric of relationships among the people who inhabit and share this community breaks down, then holiness is banished from the world. Holiness is banished from the world. If there is no consideration for the dignity that we share with one another, if there's no consideration for the lives we share with one another, if there's no breaching the ego and breaching our own subjectivity and the boundaries of our own homes to say you're welcome here, no matter what kind of animosity we've had, it's never going to get to the point where I would shame you in front of the community. If you can't abide by that simple human ethic, you don't deserve to have God in your neighborhood. You don't deserve to have God living with you. God leaves the world when human beings can't find a way to live together. So the rabbis, looking back 120, 130 years after the destruction, are looking back and saying, our first failure was to allow human relations in our community to deteriorate to such an extent that there was no reverence, no love, no care, no kindness, no compassion, no empathy. And that's what banished God from the world. Point number one. Point two, they blame themselves. No, the Romans don't even count yet. The rabbi said, Bar Kamsa said, the rabbis were sitting there and didn't do anything. Let's suppose that was true. Why do you suppose the rabbis were sitting there and didn't do anything? Why would rabbis sit there and watch a scene like that and not intervene? Can anyone guess? Can anyone got a conjecture on why the rabbis wouldn't have intervened? Douglas, why wouldn't rabbis have intervened?
Perhaps that the guy who was doing the kicking out was a big donor.
Oh, you mean there was a capitalistic
It's the wing of Valley Beth Shalom.
Oh, yeah. How much immorality are you willing to tolerate if someone writes you a big check? Okay. Could be. What else? That's not a completely plausible conjecture. Give me another idea.
Maybe
Give me another idea.
Maybe they knew the harm that was done, the maybe trauma that happened, and maybe they felt that the guy deserved to be kicked out.
Oh, okay. So there's a backstory here. There's a backstory, and everybody knew what a son of a bitch Bar Kamsa was, and they didn't want him in a party, and they were just delighted to see him get his tuchas kicked out of the party. Okay, completely plausible conjecture, Rabbi. Thank you. All right, somebody give me another one. Come on, let's get another one. All right, Ron, go ahead. Ron's a shrink. Let's see what he says. Dr. Ryder?
This is an interpretation of rabbis, but frequently people say nothing because they're afraid to choose. It's out of fear.
You know, I don't want to get involved. I came here to have a little good time, to enjoy the kids' party, you know, to eat the little hot dogs and the buns, you know, and the Argentinian beef and the Kung Pao chicken. And I didn't come here. I just want a little bit of time to be at the party. I don't want to get involved in an argument. I just don't want to get involved. It's just between these two guys. It's none of my business. Except, what is the story saying to you? It's always your business, especially if you're a rabbi, right? And the rabbi here represents anyone who leads the community. It's your business. The relationships among the people, the texture of relationships is everyone's business. That's the point. That's why community exists. That's what community is. It's what Rabbi Farkas taught us before. That's what home is about. Home isn't a place. Home is an exquisite texture of relationships where I feel like I'm safe, where I feel like I'm accepted, where I feel I have a place. And if you have a city called Jerusalem where God makes his home and a Jew doesn't feel like he's safe, maybe God don't want to live in your neighborhood no more. Maybe that's why God checked out. Go ahead, Pam, you're up.
There's another point here, which is that everybody thinks somebody else is going to fix it. And everybody's waiting for somebody else to do something. So nobody does anything.
That's all. That's true. That's a natural progression.
Well, that was the whole thing behind the Kitty Genevieve murder, where everybody's watching in the courtyard. Everybody can see it happening, and everybody thinks somebody's going to do something. So nobody does anything.
Somebody's going to call 911, right? All right, let's see what happens. You ready? So I want you to remember, this is the rabbis talking to themselves. So this is rabbinic self-flagellation, which we rabbis are really good at, thank you, right? So the rabbis are saying, you know, we learned a lesson from this. The texture of relationships within a community matters. It has implications far beyond a little dinner party. It has cosmic implications. Act 1, Scene 2. Bar Kamsa went to the Roman governor, and he says, the Jews are revolting. I'm sorry, the Jews are rebelling against you. Now, remember, the Romans are already nervous as hell because the Jews just scared the hell out of the Romans because the Romans couldn't figure out Jews. I mean, they could govern anybody in their provinces, but they couldn't govern Jews. And so when Bar Kamsa comes and says, look, I got to tell you something, the Jews are rebelling. And the Roman governor says, how can I tell? Now, remember, this is the rabbi's story. There's no way in the world for them to know what the dialogue between the governor and Bar Kamsa, if there was a guy named Bar Kamsa. This is all made up, right? So they make up this idea. The governor says, how can I tell that they're revolting, right? And he says, send them an offering and see whether they'll offer it, right? So you have to understand the geography of Jerusalem. There's a ridgeline through Jerusalem, right? The ridgeline starts at the Antonio Forest on the north, a fortress, the Antonio Fortress where the Romans hung out, right? And then there's a street called the Cardo, and it ends at the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. It's this big Roman avenue. And so what he says is send them an offering, which the governor did frequently, and see if they'll offer it. Because if they won't offer it, you know that they're rebelling against you. So he sent them a fine calf, a really nice, expensive offering. Okay? But while it was on the way, while the offering was being marched across the Cardo to the Beit HaMikdash, to the Holy Temple, Bar Kamsa made a blemish. Some say it's on his lip, on the cow's lip. Some say it was in the white of the eye, but it was in a place where the Jews counted as a blemish and therefore would disqualify it from being offered in the temple. But Romans don't count it as a blemish, right? So he made a little mum. Mum is the word for blemish. He made enough of a mum so he knew that the priests would not offer it, but he knew that the Romans wouldn't understand what the hell was going on. Now, what happens? So this cow shows up at the temple, and they announce this is a gift from the Roman governor, right? And the priests have to decide whether to offer it. And the priests see the blemish, and they don't know what to do. So according to the imagination of the rabbis, which was not accurate, they call the rabbis in, and they ask the rabbis, new rabbi, can I offer this thing? Can I offer this thing? Now, what's the argument for offering it? What's the argument for not offering it? Quick. What's the argument for offering it? Rabbi Aronoff, why should I offer it?
For the peace among where you live.
Yes, the governor offered it. If I don't offer it, the governor is going to be angry for Shalom bias, right? But not just Shalom bias. It's more than that. If the governor gets really mad, what's he going to do? He's going to crucify a few thousand Jews. So it's not just Shalom bias. There's another rule here, which is
Pikuach nefesh.
Pikuach nefesh. For the sake of Pikuach nefesh, you can violate any law except murder, adultery, and idolatry. How about offering an animal with a tiny little blemish on its upper lip? Does that count as Pikuach nefesh? You're damn right it does. So that's the argument for offering it. What's the argument for not offering it? Well, let's see what the Talmud says. The rabbis wanted to offer it. Pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh and Shalom bayis. You offer it, right? They were ready to offer it. But up steps a guy named Zachariah ben Abkulis. Remember that name? Because it never occurs anywhere in the Talmud again. He's a one-shot guy. One-hit wonder. Up steps Zachariah ben Abkulis, and he offers the following argument. People will say that blemished animals are offered on the altar. People will say that the kitchen at Valley Shalom isn't kosher enough. People will say that they don't keep the Shabbos to the Don Ariel. People will say, what kind of argument is people will say? What kind of argument is people will say? What kind of argument is that? Come on, leaders. Come on. What does that mean? What does that mean? People will say. It's an argument from weakness. I'm afraid of popular opinion. I'm afraid of this. People will say, I'm afraid of the populace. I'm afraid of the populace. So watch how absurd this becomes. You ready? Zechariah ben Abkulis says, I'm worried about popular opinion. People will say that these rabbis are not strict enough. They're not kosher enough. They're not frum enough. Ooh, that's where you get rabbis right into kishkas, right? So then they say, okay, tell you what we'll do. This is called Keystone Cops. Every action leads to a more absurd action, right? Called slapstick. So they say, all right, let's not offer it. Okay, let's not offer it. But then let's kill Bar Kamsa. So he shouldn't go and tell him that we didn't offer it. So we're going to go from offering an animal with a tiny mum on its lip to murder. You see the step? You see how quickly policy gets out of hand, right? Up steps Reb Zechariah ben Abkulis, our hero, who says, and one who makes a blemish on consecrated animals to be put to death. And so Rabbi Yochanan finished his sermon by saying, through the scrupulousness of Reb Zechariah ben Abkulis, our house has been destroyed, our temple burnt, and we were exiled from our land. Sometimes a little too much frumkeit doesn't do us any good. Sometimes you've got to be flexible. Sometimes you've got to understand that the law has to adjust itself to the circumstances in which we live and not be afraid of popular opinion. Through his frumkeit, through his pedantic interpretation of Jewish law, everything got lost. Imagine that. Now what happened? So I took out a little of the story. It's a longer story. So what happens, of course, is that the Romans come and they besiege the city. The Romans sent Vespasian, who came and besieged Jerusalem for 3 years. Now in Jerusalem, there were 3 guys. Nachdimon ben Gurion ben Kalba Savua, that's Rabbi Akiva's father-in-law, and ben Tzitzis Hakeses. And each of them declared to the people of Jerusalem, I will keep the populace in wheat and barley. The other guy said, I'll keep it in wine, oil, and salt. And the third declared, I'll keep them in wood. They were in a position to keep the city for 21 years. So ancient warfare, the way you took down a city with big walls like Jerusalem is you put a siege around it and you starve the populace. The problem is, first of all, Jerusalem has enormous walls, great defenses. And second of all, Jerusalem has an internal water source that Hezekiah built hundreds of years before this. So you can't starve them out. And there were these three very rich guys who owned giant warehouses filled with food. In other words, the city could have stood 21 years of siege, and they would have just laughed at the Romans. But what the rabbis are saying is, we could have won this easily. We could have won this easily. We could have outlasted the Romans. Why did we lose? Well, thank you for asking. Why did we lose the city? There were zealots. Who were the zealots? The zealots were a band of proto-Zionists who believed that without the land of Israel, the Jewish people falls. That the greatest example, the greatest need of the Jewish people is to have sovereignty in their own land. They were so angry. They're the ones who picked the fight with the Romans. And the zealots were living in the city. Now, the rabbis and the zealots were opposites. The rabbis wanted to make peace with the Romans. The rabbis were not pacifists, but they were ready to make peace because the rabbis believed if you can live under any government as long as it lets you learn Torah. But the zealots believed that the Roman presence in Jerusalem was an affront to God. So what happens? The rabbis said, let's go make peace with the Romans. But they wouldn't let them. On the contrary, the zealots said, let's go and make war against them. And the rabbis warned them and said, you're not going to succeed. So what did the zealots do? They went up and they burned the stores of wheat and barley, so a famine ensued. The zealots wanted the populace to fight against the Romans. So what did they do? They destroyed all the stores. In other words, what was going on in the city? There was war in the city. Jews against Jews. Just beginning to sound a little familiar? The zealots would not observe the wisdom of the rabbis. The zealots went and they burned the stores of the city and created the famine. So that they thought that would motivate the populace to revolt against the Romans. Instead, it led to this vicious, horrible famine. So here's the next scene. Abba Sikra, who's the head of the zealots, was the son of the sister of Rabbi Yochanan. You get that? He's his nephew. They're family. In case you didn't understand that we're one Jewish people, the guy who's the head of the war party is the nephew of the guy who's the head of the peace party. And Rabbi Yochanan says, come see me. And when he came, he said, how long are you going to kill all the people with starvation? And Abba Sikra said, what can I do? If I say a word to them, they'll kill me. Abba Sikra, who's the commander of the zealots, says to them, I've lost control of my armies. I've lost control of my armies. So Rabbi Yochanan says, let me get out of the city. Help me get out of the city. So he says, okay, pretend to be ill. Everyone will come see you, put something smelly so they think you're dying. When you're ready to leave the city, have your disciples carry you out. This is the famous story of how Rabbi Yochanan leaves the city. So Rabbi Yochanan is carried out in a casket and he goes to Vespasian. This is such a great scene. So he goes to Vespasian and he walks into Vespasian's tent and he says, peace be unto you, O king. And Vespasian says, the rabbis paint Vespasian like a rabbi. He talks with his thumbs, right? Your life is forfeit on 2 counts. First of all, I'm not a king, and you call me a king. And second of all, if I am a king, why the hell didn't you come to me before? Why did you let it get so bad? Vespasian asks the Rabbi Yochanan. And he says, in truth, you are a king. So if you're not, you never would get this far conquering Jerusalem. And as far as, and if you are a king, why didn't I come to you to now? The answer is the zealots among us did not let me leave. And now Vespasian answers Rabbi Yochanan, the zealots wouldn't let you leave. So Vespasian says to Rabbi Yochanan, this is pure rabbinics, if there's a jar of honey and there's a serpent wound around it, They'd have to break the jar to get rid of the serpent. What is Vespasian saying? If you're telling me that the zealots are so powerful in the city that they wouldn't let you out up until now to come talk to me and negotiate peace, then what you're telling me is I have no choice but to destroy the city and destroy the temple. That's what he's telling him. And Rabbi Yochanan couldn't answer him. And in a later generation, Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Akiva both said this is an example of a man losing his wits, because he should have said to them, if you have a jar and you have a serpent, you take a pair of tongs, you take the serpent by the tongs and you kill it and you leave the jar intact. Go into the city, take out the zealots and leave me the city. But Rabbi Yochanan couldn't answer that. At this point, a messenger came and said, arise, the emperor is dead. Mazel tov, you've been elected emperor. Everybody remember the first scene of the movie The Godfather, which at Valley Beth Shalom is scripture, so you have to go see this. The first scene is Connie Corleone's wedding. The Godfather's daughter is getting married. And on the day of the Godfather's daughter's getting married, you can come and ask him anything. Remember? And he has to give you any favors. So there were 3 favors, right? The baker wanted a visa for his new son-in-law. The funeral director wanted the guy that despoiled, that dishonored his daughter taken out, right? And Frankie wanted the part in the movie. You all remember what I'm talking about here? This is scripture. You should know this stuff, right? Okay. On the day that Vespasian is honored to become emperor, you can ask him for anything. So Vespasian says, I'm going to Rome. Someone's coming to take my place. Make a request and I'll grant it. So what does he say to him? Give me Yavne and its scholars and the family of Rabban Gamliel. Let me have safe passage with my students. Let me have a place where I can teach Torah. Let me get out of the circumstance and give me a place where I can perpetuate Torah. And once again, they said he should have asked for the temple. He could have asked for the city, but he didn't. Why didn't he ask for the city? Why didn't he ask for the city? The general system, you can have anything you want. Why didn't he ask for the city? I need everybody's answer here. Come on. All right, Douglas, why didn't he ask for the city?
Perhaps he had evolved beyond the point where he thought that the sacrificial way of worshiping God was the way to go, and that it wasn't necessary for him and his Judaism.
Okay, so one idea is that Rabbi Yochanan recognized that it's time for us to go beyond animal sacrifice, beyond this kind of tangible worship of God. And it was time to create a new Judaism. Frankly, I think it's even more than that. He recognized that any material representation of Judaism that we depend upon, one day someone's going to come and destroy it. That Judaism, if Judaism became Torah, if it became a culture of Torah learning, you could do it anywhere, and nothing that ever happened in this world would ever affect its future. And so he asks for a school. Give me Yavne and its scholars instead of the Beit HaMikdash. Mel, what do you think?
I think there's a very simple answer. There's no way you're going to trust Vespasian's word. They've got the entire thing surrounded. They can promise me anything. They're bound and determined to show that these Jews have been finished. Otherwise, their reputation as a powerful Roman army is ruined.
Right. So he looked at the strategic situation. He realized that if he had asked Vespasian for the city, Vespasian couldn't have given him that request because he'd lose face. And the guy was just elected emperor. How can you withdraw from a battle for the most important province in the world? And so that he wouldn't have given him anything. So he asked for what he thought he could get, right? Sometimes asking for less is a better strategy. Lois, what do you think?
Okay. I think he would have been stuck with the zealots if he kept the city. And he already knew what they were capable of. And
Right, so
they'd already destroyed the ability to manage, even to eat. So I think he thought that battle was lost.
To go back into the city and try to pacify the city would have been something he knew he couldn't do. This way, at least he gained something. he gained something. Good answer. Ron.
I think it reminds me a lot of what we discussed in the previous session. I think before the Zionists breaking away, that there was little hope in the old system, that they had to try something new because it was a new way, a new religiosity, a new way to worship God, that there had to be a change.
So it's a very interesting point. So let's take a look at the text again, because the text is kind of indicative. So they apply that same vignette where Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Akiva both says, God turns wise men backwards, makes their knowledge foolish. They apply that idea that he lost his wits. He ought to have said, release Jerusalem. But the Talmud then adds an answer. So the Talmud seems to represent, this is rabbis' self-talk. Remember, this isn't what really happened. This is rabbis analyzing generations later. That he wouldn't have, he knew so much would not be granted. He wanted a little bit. He wanted to save what he could. He wanted to save what he could. So does that represent the idea that the rabbis recognized that this was the turning point? That this was the turning point of a religiosity. And it was time to turn from a material-based religiosity in a land that could always be conquered by somebody to a spiritual-based religiosity that would be invulnerable to political exigencies, that would be invulnerable to conquest, right? And that was the answer of why we lost. That's the answer why he took what he took. That in fact, this isn't the end of Jewish home. It's a transfer. It's a moving of home from a material home to a spiritual home, to a different mode of being. We were once a people rooted on a land, defended by walls. And now we're a people that wanders the world, defended by a way of life, by a culture. And in a certain sense, that gave us the wherewithal to survive 1,800 years of diaspora. Well, this is the story. There's actually kind of an interesting ending of how it ends, is an imagination of how the temple was destroyed and then what happened to the guys who did it. But let's jump now to a couple of sources, and I'm going to turn this over to Rabbi Farkas now. And we can jump now to the end, to a set of sources about the rabbis reflecting specifically on why we lost our home. Rabbi, it's all yours.
Thank you. All right, so if we look at these texts here, sort of the epilogue, and just to bring us back to the space here, is we had this story of this party and this Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. We had the story of the fall of Jerusalem in the rabbinic imagination. And, just to bring it back to the center of this is it's not about, the rabbis refused to believe that this was simply a socio-political, hegemonic revolt. And then because of that, we lost our own place. We lost our home. It had to do something with the internal relationships, the breaking of the net, of the web of relationships that tie us together. It had something to do with our religiosity. It was very much more of an internal conversation than an external one. So there's a litany of taken from all over of the rabbinic literature, trying to reconcile why did we lose our home and what does that mean for us going forward. So the first one that we've put together is from Talmud. We actually looked at a second part of this same page just at the beginning of the evening from Yoma, the Masechet on Yom Kippur. And it says the first temple was just destroyed because of the sins of idolatry, sexual indecency, and murder. So the reason why the first one was destroyed, according to legend, is because of things we did against each other and things we did against God. The second temple, in spite of the widespread study of Torah, because by the time the second temple was around, Torah study became a regular practice amongst Jews. The preference and the performance of commandments and the deeds of compassion in its existence, all things that didn't exist in the first temple period in which the prophets railed against. It fell because of boundless hatred, sinat chinam, right? The word chinam means gratuitous or over the line, so to speak. Just unyielding hatred towards each other. Boundless hatred, therefore, is a sin that weighs as heavily as idolatry, sexual indecency, and murder. So this is kind of recapping the Bar Kamsa story about how the hatred, the breaking between the bonds of people in a home can actually lead to its destruction more than from within than from without. So that's really the first piece. It's sort of like a capstone. We could just end the story there. But the rabbis weren't satiated by that. They really wanted to go deeper to try to understand, why would God, who loved the Jewish people so much, allow us to be exiled? And how do we rebuild a religion in the wake of that exile? So from two different places, from Shabbat and Chagiga, two different places in the Talmud where they have parallel sources, put them together. They asked the question, why was Jerusalem, our home, destroyed? Abaye thought it is people profane Shabbat. So in Abaye's mind, he's always been a sort of a more strict religious rabbi. He thought it's because, similar to the book of Exodus and other places, when you break Shabbat, you warrant the death penalty. So therefore, if a nation breaks Shabbat, you warrant the death penalty. And that must be the one thing that was meant as a covenantal sign between God and the Jewish people. Because we broke it, that's the reason why. But then Rabbi Abahu taught they neglected to recite their prayers in the daily Shema. So, again, rabbinic imagination that the daily prayers in the Shema have been recited by everyone all the time. It's not because they didn't break the Shabbat, but because they didn't pray on a daily basis, the when and how and where they should have prayed. And then because they didn't attend to God and attend to their needs towards God, that's the reason. Rabbi Chamuma taught they stopped teaching Torah to their children. So he goes in a different direction, and he talks that it's not about the personal observance of a particular Jew or the praying of a particular Jew. It's that we didn't teach Torah anymore. Now, there's a lot to be said about that. And, like when I think about that is when we stop teaching Torah to our children, they stop learning about what Judaism is. And that every generation of Jews is the last generation of Jews until another generation learns enough Torah to become the next generation of Jews. And so it's incumbent upon us that if we have children, and of course VBS has nearly 1,000 children at school, that we have to continue to teach them our values and who we are. Ula taught they lost their sense of shame. This takes us in a completely different direction. Shame, we have taught in Western society, is a bad thing, that we shouldn't have shame. Many people have shame over things about their privacy or about their sexuality or about how their mental health or addictions or issues with family members that are not doing so well. And that's, I would call it negative shame. And what Ula was talking about in terms of this version of shame is that if you don't have any shame, you also don't have any morality. That without having a sense of what's right and wrong, when you commit an act, a sin, some kind of transgression, if you feel like you've done nothing wrong, or davka, it's wrong and just don't care, that's the mentality that breaks relationships. And we see that all the time. We see that with people who are just brazen, especially in the online community, where they call them trolls, essentially, where people just go after each other with no sense of shame about what that repercussions mean for them or for a relationship or for who they are. So they're losing a sense of shame. Different from all the other ones is that we've destroyed these relationships so much that you don't deserve to be together. It's not possible to be together. All right, so moving on, Rabbi Isaac taught they paid no respect to those who deserved reverence. So again, that's about relationships. And Rabbi Amram quoted his father, Rabbi Shimon ben Abba, which is ironic that this is the one who goes next, is because he's quoting his father, thereby showing his father reverence. So it's an interesting tikkun in the middle of the text, is that he's actually showing he did what the people of Jerusalem couldn't do, is they didn't admonish one another and turn their faces away when they saw no evil. And here, I think this is, again, it's about morality, that to be a good man or a good woman or just a good person is to not be quiet when you see injustice, and to proactively tell people, I think what you're doing is wrong, especially if you have a relationship with them. When I counsel couples, we often talk about how will you correct the behavior of your partner without destroying your partner. And if you're afraid to correct the behavior of your partner, then you're actually not building your marriage. You're building a power relationship that can be very detrimental and maybe even abusive. So what Rabbi Amram, quoting his father, is talking about here is building the kind of relationships that will essentially prevent bigger acts of evil from happening, because you can admonish each other, basically give rebuke to each other in a powerful way. And then when you do see injustice, you need to stand up and do something. Rabbi Yehuda taught that scholars hold scholars in contempt. As a rabbi, I often feel that way sometimes. I'm sure Rabbi Feinstein sometimes feels that people hold him in contempt, not because they don't agree with what he says, but they just think that we don't have a right to say what we want to say or teach what we want to teach, besides the fact that we have almost 50 years of rabbinic teaching and learning between the two of us. So, and then Rava taught there were no trustworthy persons in Jerusalem. And Rabbi Yochanan taught they insisted on the exact fulfillment of the letter of the law and never sought equity or even going beyond the letter of the law. So with the last big group of these if you just kind of put them together, I would label them under the soft skills of Jewish life as opposed to the hard skills, which are in the top. The top skills, the hard skills are ritual skills, the ability to teach Torah, praying every day, and then you get to the bottom skills, and it's all about relationships. It's knowing when to push your advantage and knowing when not to push your advantage. It's knowing when to teach and when not to teach. It's knowing what to have reverence for, even if you disagree, simply because the position matters, because it says something to the world. And so here, again, all of these rabbis come up with all of these different reasons simply because they cannot accept that it is the outside army that's destroying it. It's the character of the Jewish people that's destroying our own home. Eddie, could you slide it up just a little bit, and we'll do the last two. Thanks. All right, so there's a bunch here. So some of these are kind of give a little balm at the end, like, oh, God is with you. I want to just do the one from Avot Rabbi Natan. Avot Rabbi Natan is a midrash of Rabbi Nathan on his commentary on Pirkei Avot. That's why it's called Avot to Rabbi Natan. This is from chapter 4. When the temple was set afire, the chief priests who were in the temple took their keys in their hands and hurled them skyward, exclaiming, "The Holy One, Lord of the universe, Ribono Shel Olam, here are your keys that you entrusted to us. Since we have not been faithful custodians to carry out the duties set by the king, we're no longer worthy to eat at the king's table." And in a different midrash, it says that the keys went up to heaven and never came back down. They literally tossed them in the air. The idea here being, of course, rather than turn the keys over to the Romans, who were coming in to destroy and burn the temple, they gave the keys back to God and said, "We didn't do a good job. Take these back." And we're waiting for God to give us the keys back. And the idea there, again, is that it's not the outside army or the outside people that want us to see ourselves undone. It's our own characters, who we are, and we forget what we stand for. And if you go back to the beginning of what Hillel said at the very first text, he says, "Ima ni kan, hakol kan, ve'in ani ein kan, mikan." If I am here, then everyone is here. And if I'm not here, then who will really be here? And the idea from that piece of Talmud, again, is that to build a home takes a lot of effort and a lot of chesed, a lot of loving kindness, and a lot of relationships that have to be built between you and me and people who look like us and people who don't look like us, Jews who agree with us and certainly Jews who don't agree with us. But if we don't put in our presence to try to build it, then no one will be there. There'll be no one there to build a home. And if we're not here to build a home, then our enemies deserve to be at our borders and take it away from us. That's the rabbinic attitude. And I think that attitude is still important for us today. That regardless of what other people say, or what other people think, or what other people believe, about Jews, about the state of Israel, about the state of affairs in Israel. We have to live up to our Jewish values. We have to admonish each other to live up to our Jewish values, and we have to build a home for each other, because no state is worth keeping if we can't live in it. And I think that, to me, again, I'm not here to be political about it, but I'm here to be rabbinic about it. How we talk to each other, even if we disagree, is as important as what we say. Rabbi Feinstein.
Well, everyone, Yasher Koach, it is it's past 10:30 already, and some of you are still awake. I am very impressed. So thank you for sharing learning with us tonight on home and homelessness, on returning home, on Zionism as homecoming, and as how God entered the world and how God leaves the world. So let's finish with a prayer for learning, and then we'll wish everybody a good night. If you'd like to stay up all night learning, you're much stronger than me, but there are lots of opportunities online. I would recommend the United Synagogue and Rabbinical Assembly all-night Tikkun, which is still going on. I taught earlier in the evening, but it's still going on. You can still connect with it, and they're going to be doing stuff all night long, and there's some wonderful young rabbis teaching late at night, because all of us old guys are going to bed. But have a wonderful, wonderful time. So let's join together in a quick Kaddish, celebrating Jewish learning, and we'll wish everybody a very good night. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah, v'yamad yivrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayachon v'yomechon v'chayidechol Beit Yisrael b'agalav v'zman kariv v'yimramein. Yehei shmei Rabbah v'arach le'olam u'me'omaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei dekucha b'richu. Leyl min kol berchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata damiran b'yalma v'yimramein. Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Talmidehon v'al kol Talmidei Talmidehon v'al kol man de'askim b'araita di b'atra dein v'kol b'kol atar v'atar Yelahon l'chon shlama rabba china v'chista v'rachami v'chayim arichim v'zona ravicha v'pukana mikada v'shamayim v'yimuramein Yesh shlama rabbin shamaya v'chayim tovim alenu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimuramein Oseh shalom b'mromav hu barachamav yaseh shalom alenu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru. Amen. Please, God, bless us with peace this Yontif and care for the people of Israel all over the world. And together we pray, Amen. Thank you for staying up with us. Thank you for learning with us. Take good care. We'll see you over the course of the Yontif and during the course of the week beyond. Good night. Ilana, thank you so much. Rabbi, thank you so much. And to everyone who stayed up, good night. Baruch Tia, to everyone, take care. Stay well.
Talk to you both.
I need one of you to turn off the streaming.